I moved to Seattle almost 6 months ago, not long after I broke up with my ex, Jessica. We had a rough end to our relationship and the breakup felt overdue. She was manipulative and controlling, but part of me still felt bad for leaving things the way I did. I figured it would all blow over in time, especially with me moving to a new city, hundreds of miles away. I wanted to start fresh. At first, everything seemed fine. I found a small, one-bedroom apartment in Capitol Hill. It's an older building, nothing fancy, but it had character. The kind of place where the walls are a bit thin and you can hear your neighbors sometimes, but it's mostly quiet. I liked that about it. I got a job at a tech startup downtown, and I was finally feeling like things were looking up for me after months of stress. About a month after I moved in, things started getting weird. It was small stuff at first, the kind of things that are easy to brush off as coincidence or just forgetfulness. I'd come home and notice my front door felt off. Not wide open or anything dramatic, but like it wasn't fully shut, just slightly ajar. I always locked my door, so I assumed I must have just not pulled it all the way shut one day in a hurry. But then it happened again, and I started second-guessing myself. Maybe the lock was faulty? I never had any issues with it, but it's an old building, so I figured I'd let the landlord know. He sent over a locksmith the next day, and the guy checked it out, but he didn't find anything wrong. He even gave me new keys, just in case. That should have made me feel better, but it didn't. Something still felt off. A couple of weeks after that, I started getting these phone calls late at night. The first time it happened, I didn't think much of it. I was already half asleep when my phone buzzed, and I assumed it was just a telemarketer or some spam call. I checked it the next morning, but there was no number, no voicemail. The calls started happening almost every night after that, always around 2 or 3 a.m. I'd pick up and there'd be nothing. Just silence, maybe some faint breathing, but it was hard to tell. Every time I asked, "Who is this?" the line would go dead. I blocked the number, but it didn't help. The calls still came through, always from a different number, sometimes even marked as unknown. I thought about changing my phone number, but that seemed extreme. I told myself it was probably some prank or spam, though I couldn't understand why someone would go to that much effort. I mean, who even knows my number here? I barely had time to make friends yet. Around that same time, I started noticing little things around my apartment. It was always subtle, stuff that could easily be chalked up to my imagination. A chair that wasn't quite where I remembered leaving it. A book that seemed out of place, or my keys being somewhere I didn't recall putting them. I was still getting used to the new apartment, so I tried not to overthink it. One day, I came home and noticed something that shook me up more than the other incidents. I always keep my apartment fairly neat, so when I saw my desk drawer slightly open, I paused. I hadn't touched that drawer in days. Inside were some important documents, old bank statements, stuff like that. Nothing was missing, but it felt disturbed, like someone had been through it but put everything back almost exactly how they found it. I stood there for a few minutes, staring at the drawer, trying to convince myself I was just being paranoid. That night, the phone rang again. This time I didn't pick up. I just stared at the screen, watching it buzz on the nightstand until it stopped. Then I got up and checked every door and window in the apartment, making sure they were locked. I even propped a chair against the front door like I'd seen in movies. I wasn't sure if it would actually help, but it gave me a weird sense of comfort. A few days later, something else happened that I couldn't ignore. I woke up in the morning and found the door to my apartment unlocked. Wide open, actually. I always check the door before going to bed, and I was 100% sure I locked it the night before. But there it was, slightly open, as if someone had just left in a hurry. My heart was pounding as I checked the place, but nothing seemed out of place. Nothing was missing. It didn't make any sense. Why would someone break in and not take anything? I tried to rationalize it, maybe I was sleepwalking or something, but I've never had that problem before. I even called the landlord to ask if anyone else had keys to my place, but he assured me it was just me. By this point, I was getting pretty freaked out. I started paying more attention to my surroundings, especially at night. My bedroom window faces a narrow alleyway, and I started noticing movement down there. At first, I told myself it was just the usual city traffic, people walking by or cats rummaging through trash. But after a while, it became clear that someone was standing down there. I couldn't make out much from the window, just the outline of a figure, sometimes leaning against the wall, other times just standing there. They were never looking directly up at my window, but it was too much of a coincidence. I didn't want to call the police for something that might just be a random person hanging out in the alley, so I bought some cheap security cameras from Amazon and installed them. I put one by my front door and another inside, pointing toward the living room. I figured it would at least give me some peace of mind. The first few nights after I set them up, nothing happened. No weird calls, no one in the alley, no unlocked doors. It was almost like things had returned to normal. But then I checked the camera footage one morning and my heart dropped. The front door camera had recorded someone standing just outside my door around 3 a.m. They didn't knock or try to open it. They just stood there for a few minutes before walking away. The footage was grainy and I couldn't make out a face, but the figure was definitely there, just lurking. I didn't sleep much that night. The next day I took the footage to the police. They watched it, but said there wasn't much they could do since no crime had actually been committed. They suggested I change my locks again and maybe consider getting a better security system. I felt like I was going crazy. Was this person just messing with me, or was it something more serious? A week later, I came home from work and things were worse. My front door was unlocked again, and this time the camera inside the apartment had recorded someone entering. The footage showed the person standing in my living room for nearly 20 minutes, just looking around. They didn't touch anything, didn't take anything. They just stood there, then left. I couldn't see their face, but something about the way they moved made me think it was Jessica. I hadn't talked to her since the breakup, and part of me had hoped she'd just moved on. But now, I wasn't so sure. I mean, who else would go to this length? The person in the video moved with a kind of familiarity, like they knew the space. It made me sick to my stomach to think she had been in my apartment while I was out. I tried calling her, but she didn't answer. I sent her a message and she left me on read. I didn't want to outright accuse her in case I was wrong, but I couldn't ignore the growing suspicion. I ended up blocking her number after that. I changed the locks again, but I still didn't feel safe. The calls kept coming, even with her number blocked, and I started noticing more subtle things around my place. Little items moved, or things just slightly out of place. A picture frame tilted, a cup I didn't remember using left on the counter. I even found a pair of shoes under my bed that weren't mine. It felt like no matter what I did, she, or whoever it was always a step ahead. The police were no help. Without solid evidence of a break-in, they couldn't do much, and the footage I had wasn't enough to identify anyone. I didn't have the money to move again, and breaking my lease wasn't an option. I became hyper-vigilant, checking my cameras every morning and double-checking every lock before bed. I stopped going out much, always worried about leaving my apartment unattended. But even when I was there, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone else had been in my space, that they were still watching, still waiting for the next opportunity. The last straw came a few weeks ago. I woke up in the middle of the night to find my bedroom door wide open. I never leave it open, ever. I always close it before bed, a habit I've had for as long as I can remember. My heart was racing and I didn't know what to do. I just sat there in bed staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The silence was deafening. I checked the cameras the next morning, but there was no footage of anyone entering the apartment. The door had opened on its own, or maybe the camera glitched. I don't know. I'm still trying to figure it out. At this point, I've stopped sleeping much. Every noise, every creak in the floor, every gust of wind outside feels like a threat. I'm stuck in this weird limbo where I don't know if I'm being paranoid or if someone is actually messing with me. All I know is that it's exhausting and I can't keep living like this. About 2 years ago, I went through a messy breakup with my ex, John. It wasn't the kind of breakup where you stay friends or even say goodbye properly. Things were bad between us by the end, and I knew staying together wasn't an option anymore. He had this obsessive, controlling side that I didn't see at first, and it got to a point where I didn't recognize myself anymore. So I finally left. After the breakup, I did what most people do. I tried to move on. I blocked his number, unfollowed him on social media, and got rid of most of his stuff. I figured that was the best way to start fresh, and for a while it felt like it was working. I met someone new, a guy named Alex, who was kind, supportive, and everything John wasn't. It felt like I was getting my life back on track slowly but surely. But then things started getting weird. It all started with the letters. I didn't think much of the first one. Alex was the one who found it, actually. We had just come back to my apartment from dinner, and when I checked the mailbox, there it was. An envelope with my name on it, but no return address. I assumed it was just some junk mail or maybe a bill, but when I opened it, my heart sank. It was a letter from John. I hadn't heard from him in months, and suddenly, there he was, right in my mailbox. The letter wasn't threatening, not exactly. It was more of a rambling mess of apologies, confessions, and weird, overly emotional stuff about how he missed me, how he never stopped thinking about me, and how he knew we were meant to be together. I tossed the letter aside, trying to convince myself it was just one of those desperate attempts to get attention that people sometimes do after breakups. Alex told me not to worry about it. We both agreed it was probably a one-time thing. But the letters kept coming. Almost every week, I'd get another one. Each letter was weirder than the last. They started getting more personal, referencing things about my life that I hadn't told him, things he shouldn't have known. One letter mentioned the coffee shop I go to every morning before work, like he'd seen me there. Another one talked about how he heard I'd been spending more time with Alex and how he didn't like it. That freaked me out because I hadn't posted anything about Alex online, and as far as I knew, John didn't know about him. At first, I tried ignoring the letters. I didn't respond, and I didn't tell anyone except Alex. But after the 5th or 6th one, I decided to take it to the police. I wasn't sure if they could do anything, but I wanted to at least have it on record. The officer I spoke to was sympathetic, but ultimately told me there wasn't much they could do unless John made a direct threat or showed up at my place. They advised me to keep the letters just in case things escalated. A few weeks later, the letters got worse. They stopped being these weird love letters and started feeling more like a threat. In one of them, John described in detail how he had seen me at the gym, watching me from the parking lot as I went about my workout. He mentioned the exact time I had been there, what I was wearing, and even the equipment I had used. I don't know how long he had been doing this, but the idea that he was watching me without me knowing made my skin crawl. Then, another letter came, but this one wasn't addressed to me. It was addressed to Alex. Somehow, John had found out where Alex lived, and he had sent him a letter too. The content was similar, rambling, unhinged stuff about how he was concerned about my well-being and how Alex wasn't good enough for me. Alex didn't show me the full letter, but from the parts I saw, it was clear that John had been keeping tabs on both of us. At this point, Alex started getting worried too. We talked about going to the police again, but we knew it would probably be the same result as last time. Without a direct threat, they couldn't do much. Still, we started taking some precautions. Alex got a new security system for his house, and I tried to change up my routine, going to different coffee shops and changing my schedule at the gym. But even with all those precautions, the letters kept coming. It wasn't just the letters, though. After a while, I started getting the sense that John knew more about my life than he should. He started mentioning things in the letters that were way too specific. Things about my conversations with friends or family. Places I had been that I hadn't told anyone about. Even small details about what I'd bought at the grocery store. It felt like he was everywhere. Like there was no part of my life that was safe from him. Then, there was the letter that really pushed me over the edge. It was different from the others. Instead of being a handwritten note, it was printed out, and it was more like a list than a letter. It was a list of places I went regularly: my gym, my favorite coffee shop, the grocery store, even my parents' house. But what really got to me was the last item on the list. It was my work address. John had never mentioned my job before, and I'd done everything I could to keep that part of my life private. But somehow, he had found out where I worked. I remember just staring at the letter, feeling a pit form in my stomach. It wasn't just that he knew where I worked, it was the way he wrote it. Like he had been there, like he had seen me at my office. After that, I was done trying to handle this on my own. I took all the letters back to the police, and this time, I made it clear how scared I was. They opened a file on the case and agreed to contact John to warn him off, but they still couldn't do much without him making a direct threat or violating a restraining order, which I hadn't filed yet. They suggested I go through the process of filing one, which I did, but I knew it would take time before it was finalized. I also started noticing other weird things happening around my apartment. Little things, like the feeling that someone had been inside. I started finding letters left in strange places, not just in the mailbox anymore. One was tucked under my windshield wiper. Another was slid under my door. That one freaked me out the most because my apartment building is supposed to be secure, with a locked front entrance. But somehow, John had gotten in. I talked to my landlord about upgrading the security in the building, but it wasn't a priority for them. So I bought my own cameras, one for the hallway outside my door and one for the inside of my apartment. I didn't want to think about what I might find, but at this point I needed to know if John was actually coming inside. A few days after I set up the cameras, I got another letter. This time it was a photo, a picture of me, taken from across the street while I was walking into my building. On the back, John had written a short note. "You can't hide from me." I don't know how long I sat there staring at that picture, but it felt like hours. I felt exposed, like there was nowhere I could go that he couldn't reach me. The cameras I had set up didn't show much. I watched the footage every day, hoping to catch something, but there were no clear signs of him coming into the building. I started to wonder if I was missing something, if maybe he was using a different entrance, or had somehow gotten a key to my apartment. The paranoia was eating away at me, and I felt like I couldn't trust anyone. I stopped going out as much, mostly staying at Alex's place when I could. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that John was always nearby, watching, waiting for the next opportunity to mess with my life. Alex tried to be supportive, but I could tell this was starting to take a toll on him too. He was always on edge, checking the windows and the security cameras more often than usual. It was like we were both living in this constant state of anxiety, never knowing when or where John might show up next. Then, one night, I came home from work, and there was another letter waiting for me inside my apartment. This one wasn't in the mailbox or under the door, it was sitting on my kitchen counter. I had locked the door before I left that morning, and there were no signs of forced entry. The cameras didn't show anyone entering the apartment, but the letter was there, plain as day. It was short, just a few lines, but it was enough to send me spiraling. John had written about how he had been inside my apartment while I was at work, how he had watched me sleep the night before. He described my bedroom in detail, things I hadn't told anyone about. I felt like I was losing my mind. How had he gotten in? How had he bypassed the cameras? I couldn't stay there anymore. I packed a bag and left, crashing at Alex's place for a few days. I knew I needed to do something more drastic. Moving out seemed like the only option, but even then I wasn't sure it would stop him. John had proven that he could find me no matter where I was, and the idea of leaving just felt like running away from a problem that would follow me. Eventually, I did file for a restraining order, and after what felt like forever, it was granted. But by then, the damage had already been done. I couldn't sleep without wondering if John was still out there, lurking, watching. Every time I got the mail, I half expected another letter to show up. When I first separated from my ex, things felt chaotic. We had been together for nearly 6 years, and it was one of those relationships that started out great but became controlling and manipulative. After we split, I moved to San Diego to start fresh, hoping that putting some distance between us would help me rebuild my life. It was a big change, but one I felt I needed. Being a single mom was the most challenging part of it all. My daughter Maddie had just turned 3, and she was still adjusting to everything. But I was hopeful. I found a job working as an administrative assistant at a marketing firm downtown, and I was finally starting to find my footing. The only problem was that I needed to hire someone to help watch Maddie during the day while I worked. At first I considered daycare, but after touring a few places, I wasn't comfortable with leaving Maddie in such a big, crowded environment. I wanted something more personal, someone who could give her one-on-one attention. A friend from work recommended a babysitter, Emily, who had watched her kids before. She vouched for her, saying Emily was responsible, good with kids, and always professional. I figured if my friend trusted her with her kids, I could too. Emily came by for an interview, and everything seemed fine. She was in her mid-20s, soft-spoken, and seemed to genuinely like children. Maddie took to her right away, and that was enough for me. I hired her to watch Maddie during the day while I was at work, and the arrangement seemed perfect at first. For the first few weeks, everything seemed normal. I'd leave for work around 7:30 a.m. and get home by 5:30 p.m. Emily always had Maddie fed, bathed, and in her pajamas by the time I got back. I didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. Maddie was her usual playful self, and Emily seemed attentive and trustworthy. But then things started to change. It wasn't obvious at first, but Maddie's behavior began to shift. She'd always been a happy kid, full of energy, but she started having nightmares, waking up in the middle of the night screaming for me. I chalked it up to the stress of the move and the changes in her routine. I thought she'd adjust with time, but then she started saying strange things. One day when I picked her up, she kept asking about the bad man. At first, I didn't think much of it. Kids have vivid imaginations, and she'd recently been watching a lot of cartoons. I figured it was just something she'd picked up from TV. But she kept bringing it up, saying things like, "The bad man watches me," and "the bad man is mean." When I asked her to explain, she just got quiet and didn't want to talk about it. It was strange, but I didn't push it. I figured it was a phase or some weird nightmare she kept having. Then came the day I decided to come home early. My boss had let me leave work around noon because we'd finished a big project ahead of schedule. I didn't let Emily know I was coming back early. I thought I'd surprise Maddie and take her out for ice cream. But when I walked into the apartment, something felt off immediately. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Maddie wasn't making any noise, which was strange for her. She's usually full of energy, playing or babbling about something. I crept into the living room, and that's when I heard Emily's voice, but she wasn't talking to Maddie. She was on the phone with someone, pacing back and forth with her back to me. I stopped in my tracks, trying to figure out what she was saying. She didn't notice me standing there, and I could hear her clearly, even though her tone was low. She was giving someone a rundown of my daily schedule when I left for work, when I usually got home, even small details like what time Maddie took her naps. It didn't make any sense at first. Why would she be telling someone that? Then she said my ex's name. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. My head started spinning and I didn't know what to do. She was talking to Daniel, my ex. He was the one she was reporting to. The realization hit me like a brick. She'd been spying on me for him this whole time. She knew everything about my day-to-day life, and she'd been feeding him information. I tried to stay calm even though my heart was racing. I backed out of the living room, grabbed my phone, and texted Emily that I was coming home early and was about 5 minutes away. Then I waited in the hallway, just out of sight, to see what she would do. As soon as she got my text, I heard her wrap up her conversation quickly and hang up. When I walked back in, she was sitting on the couch with Maddie, acting like nothing had happened. I tried to act normal too, but inside I was terrified. Who knows what she had told him? How much had she been sharing, and for how long? I didn't say anything to Emily right away. I wasn't sure how to handle it. I wanted to confront her, to demand answers, but I knew I needed to be smart. I had no proof, just what I'd overheard. So I let her leave that day without saying a word, but as soon as she was gone, I started panicking. What was Daniel planning? Was he trying to find a way to get back into my life? Was he watching me, just like Maddie had said? That night I barely slept. Every noise in the apartment made me jump. I couldn't stop thinking about the possibility that Daniel had been watching us this whole time, using Emily to keep tabs on me. The more I thought about it, the more things started to make sense. Maddie's talk about the bad man, her sudden nightmares, her anxiety. Daniel had always been possessive, and now it seemed like he was trying to keep control, even from a distance. The next morning, I didn't send Maddie to Emily. I called in sick to work and spent the entire day researching my options. I didn't want to call the police without solid evidence, and I didn't want to tip off Emily or Daniel that I was onto them. I felt trapped, like I couldn't trust anyone. Over the next few days, I started paying closer attention to my surroundings. I changed my daily routine, stopped using the same routes to work, and took Maddie to different parks and places we hadn't been before. I also started documenting everything, every strange interaction, every offhand comment Emily had made, and every suspicious moment from the past few months. One day, while I was cleaning the apartment, I found something that confirmed my worst fears. Hidden behind one of the picture frames in my bedroom was a small listening device. It was tucked behind the frame so neatly that I never would have noticed it unless I'd been dusting that particular spot. My stomach turned when I saw it. This wasn't just about Emily feeding Daniel information. He'd been actively spying on me, listening to everything that happened in my apartment. I immediately took the device and went to the police. This time, they took me seriously. They told me that while it wasn't uncommon for abusers to use tactics like this to maintain control, it was still illegal, and they would investigate. They also advised me to cut off all contact with Emily and to document anything else suspicious. I didn't wait to hear back from the police before firing Emily. I told her over text that I wouldn't need her services anymore, trying to keep the message as vague as possible so she wouldn't suspect anything. I didn't want to give her or Daniel any warning that I knew what they'd been doing. The police came by to search the apartment and found another device, this one in Maddie's room. I felt physically ill knowing that Daniel had been listening to us, that he'd violated my privacy like that. It explained so much. Why he always seemed to know things he shouldn't, why Maddie had been so anxious and afraid of the bad man. I changed all the locks on my apartment and installed a security system, but the damage was already done. Every time I walked through the door, I couldn't help but feel exposed, like there was still something lurking that I hadn't found yet. I couldn't shake the fear that Daniel was still out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to make his next move. The police couldn't find enough evidence to arrest him right away, but they were keeping an eye on things. In the meantime, I felt completely helpless. No matter how many precautions I took, it felt like there was always another layer of Daniel's control waiting to be uncovered. The worst part was Maddie. She started refusing to sleep in her room, insisting on staying in my bed every night. She stopped talking about the bad man, but I knew she was still scared. I didn't know how to explain everything to her without making it worse, so I just held her tight and tried to reassure her that we were safe, even though I wasn't sure if that was true. In the end, I had to accept that my life would never feel the same again. No matter how far I tried to run from Daniel, he always seemed to find a way to worm his way back in. Maybe the police would eventually catch him, or maybe he'd slip up and leave more evidence. But until then, I was stuck living in a constant state of fear, never knowing when or where he might strike next. I never thought breaking up with Laura would lead to my life completely falling apart, but that's exactly what happened. We'd been together for almost 3 years, and by the end, things were a mess. She was controlling, manipulative, and made everything feel like a constant argument. I didn't recognize the person I was when I was with her, and it took me a long time to build up the courage to walk away. We broke up about a year ago. It wasn't exactly a clean break. Laura didn't take it well. She kept trying to contact me, showing up at places she knew I'd be, making excuses to call or text. At first I responded, thinking I owed her that much after everything we went through together. But the conversations always ended up going the same way. She'd cry, ask for another chance, then get angry when I told her it wasn't going to happen. After a few months of this, I finally blocked her number and her social media accounts. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. A few weeks after I blocked her, I started getting these weird emails from random people I didn't know. The first one was from some guy I'd never met, accusing me of sending him harassing messages. I was confused and just deleted it, assuming it was some scam or phishing attempt. But then more emails started coming in. People telling me to stop messaging them, stop sending inappropriate comments, or worse, demanding I apologize for things I hadn't said or done. I didn't understand what was happening until I got an email from a mutual friend of ours. He told me that Laura had been creating fake accounts under my name, sending out messages to people, pretending to be me. She'd been messaging random women, making vulgar comments, and sending inappropriate pictures. She was impersonating me online and trashing my reputation. I confronted her about it through a mutual friend because, at this point, she was blocked everywhere. I told him to pass along the message that she needed to stop, that this was going too far. She denied everything, of course, but I knew it was her. Who else would go to this level of insanity? The problem was there was no real way to prove it. She was using fake accounts, and it was her word against mine. Things only got worse from there. It wasn't just strangers getting these fake messages. It started spreading to my friends, co-workers, even my boss. One morning, I got called into a meeting at work. My boss sat me down and asked me if I'd been sending inappropriate messages to one of our clients. Apparently, someone had created a fake email address that looked almost identical to mine and had sent out a series of emails to one of our key clients, threatening them and making disgusting comments. I was in shock. I tried to explain to my boss that it wasn't me, that someone was impersonating me, but I could tell he was skeptical. Who would believe that? It sounded like some made-up excuse to avoid getting in trouble. I almost lost my job that day. They didn't fire me, but the damage was done. I could tell people at work were looking at me differently after that, like I was some creep they couldn't trust. I started noticing people around me acting strange too. Friends who used to text or call regularly just stopped. People who I'd been close with for years suddenly became distant, barely responding to my messages or avoiding me altogether. At first I thought I was imagining it, but then I found out why. Laura had been messaging them too. She'd made fake social media accounts in my name and was sending messages to my friends, saying horrible things, spreading lies about me, making it seem like I was unstable, violent, or worse. She was framing me for things I hadn't done, and slowly she was turning everyone against me. I tried explaining the situation to a few close friends, but even they seemed hesitant to believe me. I could see it in their faces, the doubt. I mean, why would someone go to this much trouble just to mess with me? It sounded crazy, and I felt crazy even saying it out loud. The worst part was that Laura wasn't just targeting my social circle. She was going after my professional life too. I was working on a big project with a team, and we were coordinating everything through emails and group chats. One day, I missed an important meeting because I never got the email with the details. When I checked my inbox, I realized someone had deleted it before I ever saw it. I checked my trash folder, and sure enough, there it was. An invitation to the meeting that had mysteriously been deleted. I started digging through my email and found several other important messages that had been deleted or marked as read without me ever seeing them. I realized what was happening. Laura must have hacked into my email account. She knew my passwords from when we were together, and I hadn't thought to change them after we broke up. She was messing with my emails, deleting important ones, and sending fake messages to people I worked with. She was sabotaging my career, making sure I missed deadlines, important meetings, and opportunities. I changed all my passwords immediately, thinking that would fix the problem, but it didn't stop. She must have installed some kind of spyware on my devices, because even after changing my passwords, she still seemed to have access. My phone would act weird, random apps opening on their own, messages disappearing before I could read them, my battery draining faster than usual. I tried wiping my phone and laptop, but nothing worked. It felt like she was always one step ahead, always finding a way to stay in control. At this point, I didn't know who to trust. My friends barely spoke to me anymore. My coworkers were distant, and I was constantly paranoid that Laura was still watching everything I did. I couldn't go to the police. What would I tell them? That my ex was impersonating me online and sabotaging my life? It sounded ridiculous, and even if they believed me, there wasn't much they could do without concrete evidence. One day, I got a call from a mutual friend of ours, someone who hadn't been caught up in the mess yet. He told me that Laura had been telling people I was dangerous, that I was stalking her, sending her threatening messages, and that she was scared for her safety. She'd even gone so far as to file a fake police report against me, claiming I had been harassing her. I couldn't believe it. She was framing me as the villain in all of this, and I had no way of proving otherwise. At this point, my entire social circle had turned against me. People who I'd been friends with for years wouldn't return my calls. Mutual friends with Laura completely cut me off. They believed her lies, and why wouldn't they? She had the fake messages, the fake social media accounts, and now a fake police report to back up her story. I was completely isolated. The worst part was how helpless I felt. No matter what I did, Laura was always one step ahead. I'd block her accounts, but she'd just make new ones. I'd change my passwords, but she'd still find a way in. I started living in constant fear of what she'd do next, what lies she'd tell, what rumors she'd spread, what piece of my life she'd destroy. Every time I thought things couldn't get worse, they did. I became paranoid, second-guessing every interaction, every email, every text. I couldn't trust anyone anymore, not even myself. I started withdrawing from everything. Work, social events, even my family. I didn't want to explain what was happening because I knew how crazy it sounded. The more I tried to fight back, the more trapped I felt. Eventually, I had no choice but to leave. I quit my job, packed up my apartment, and moved to a different city, far away from anyone who knew Laura. It was the only way I could think of to escape her, to try and start over somewhere new. But even then, the damage was done. My reputation had been ruined. My friendships destroyed and my career derailed. Laura had taken everything from me, and there was nothing I could do about it. When I broke up with Jake, I thought I was finally free. We had been together for almost 2 years, and it was one of those relationships that started out passionate and intense, but somewhere along the line, it just turned toxic. He wasn't physically abusive, but he was controlling, manipulative. He always had to know where I was, who I was with, and what I was doing. By the end, I felt like I couldn't breathe around him. So I packed up and left. I didn't tell him where I was going. I just moved. I found a place in a quiet suburb just outside of Portland, Oregon. The house wasn't much, but it was mine. A little 2-bedroom bungalow on a street where kids still played outside and people knew their neighbors. It was the perfect place for a fresh start. Far enough from the chaos of downtown Portland, but still close enough that I could easily get to work. I felt like I was finally taking control of my life again. I even got a dog, a golden retriever named Cooper, to keep me company. Life was quiet for a few months, and I started to feel normal again. Then, one day, I came home from work and noticed a moving truck across the street. A new neighbor was moving in, and I thought nothing of it. I went about my evening as usual, walking Cooper around the block, making dinner, and relaxing with a book before bed. The next morning I saw him, Jake, standing on the sidewalk in front of the house across the street. I thought my heart was going to stop. I tried to convince myself it wasn't him, that I was just seeing things. But no, it was definitely Jake. He saw me too. Our eyes met for a brief moment, and he gave me this small, knowing smile. It was impossible. How could he be here? Of all the neighborhoods in Portland, of all the streets and houses, what were the odds that he would end up right across the street from me? I couldn't wrap my head around it. It had to be some kind of twisted coincidence. I mean, sure, Portland's not the biggest city, but the chances of him moving across the street from me were ridiculous. I tried to avoid him, hoping that if I just ignored him, he'd leave me alone. I told myself that maybe it really was a coincidence, and that he'd probably move on with his life. But Jake wasn't the kind of guy to let things go easily. At first, it was little things. I'd see him accidentally bump into me when I was walking Cooper. He'd wave and say something like, "Hey neighbor," or make a comment about the weather. I kept my responses short, trying to be civil but distant, always walking away as quickly as I could. But then it started happening more frequently. I'd see him outside my house, trimming the hedges or washing his car, always at times when I'd be coming or going. A few weeks went by and Jake's presence became more persistent. He'd be in the driveway when I left for work in the morning, always with a casual "have a good day" as I walked to my car. When I came home, he'd be out there too, asking me how my day was. It felt so fake, so forced, like he was trying to make it seem normal, but I knew it wasn't. I tried talking to my friends about it, but they brushed it off. Maybe it was a coincidence, they said. Maybe Jake really had no idea that I lived there before he moved in. I wanted to believe them, but deep down I knew Jake better than that. This wasn't an accident. Then came the excuses to visit my house. One evening he knocked on my door saying he needed to borrow some sugar. The next week he asked if I had jumper cables. Another time it was a package accidentally delivered to my address. Each time I'd reluctantly help him, but I started feeling this growing sense of dread. He was slowly worming his way back into my life, bit by bit, pretending that everything was normal. The worst part was, I couldn't prove anything. He wasn't doing anything illegal or threatening. He wasn't sending me messages or showing up at places I frequented. He was just asterisk there asterisk, right across the street, always in my line of sight, always watching me. I tried to avoid going outside when he was around, but it seemed like no matter when I left or came back, he was there. Sometimes I'd catch him standing at his window just looking in my direction. He never waved or smiled during those moments. He just stood there, watching. It made my skin crawl. A few months into this nightmare, I started noticing things around my house that didn't seem right. Little things, like the garden gate being open when I knew I had closed it. A window in the living room cracked open just a bit, even though I never opened that window. One night I came home to find the back door unlocked. I was sure I had locked it before leaving. Nothing inside seemed disturbed, but it freaked me out. I changed the locks and installed security cameras. It helped a little, but I still felt on edge. I couldn't shake the idea that Jake was getting inside somehow. Maybe it was paranoia, or maybe he was just messing with me, trying to make me feel unsafe. Either way, it was working. One night I was lying in bed when I heard a noise outside, like someone moving around near the side of the house. I grabbed my phone and checked the security camera feed, but it didn't show anything. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I stayed up most of the night, listening for any more noises, but eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell asleep. The next morning I found something that confirmed my fears. Sitting on my front porch was a single rose. No note, no explanation, just a rose. I knew it was from Jake. It was exactly the kind of thing he'd do. Some twisted attempt to remind me that he was always there, always watching. I wanted to confront him, to demand that he leave me alone, but I was too scared. What if he escalated? What if this was just the beginning of something worse? After that, I started seeing him more and more. He'd be out front every morning when I left for work, just standing there with his coffee, watching me. Sometimes he'd make small talk, but more often than not, he wouldn't say anything at all. Just stand there, staring as I got into my car and drove away. I couldn't escape him, even in my own home. I'd closed the blinds, but I could still feel his presence, like he was just outside, waiting. Every creak, every rustle of the wind outside sent my heart racing. I was constantly on edge, jumping at the smallest noises, checking the locks on every door and window obsessively. I barely slept. One night I woke up to Cooper barking like crazy. He never barked like that unless something was wrong. I grabbed a flashlight and went to check the backyard. There was nothing there, but the side gate was wide open. I know I had locked it earlier. My stomach dropped. Was Jake messing with me again? I checked the security camera footage from earlier in the night, but it showed nothing. Just static during the time I heard the barking. I didn't know if the camera malfunctioned or if Jake had found a way to disable it. At this point, I didn't know what to do. I called the police, but without any hard evidence, there wasn't much they could do. Jake hadn't threatened me directly, and technically he wasn't trespassing since I couldn't prove he'd been inside my house. The cops did a patrol of the area, but they didn't find anything suspicious. They said they'd keep an eye out, but I knew they weren't taking it seriously. Over the next few weeks, things escalated. I started getting anonymous notes left on my car windshield. Messages like, "You can't hide forever," or "I'll always be here." Each note was unsigned, but I knew it was Jake. He was playing a game, trying to break me down, trying to make me feel like there was no escape. I considered moving again, but I couldn't afford it. I'd already spent most of my savings relocating the first time, and the thought of picking up my life and starting over yet again was exhausting. But at the same time, I knew staying here wasn't safe either. The final straw came one evening when I came home from work and found my front door wide open. I rushed inside, heart pounding, expecting the worst. But nothing seemed out of place, nothing was missing. Everything was exactly where I left it. Except for one thing. On the kitchen counter there was a single picture frame. It was a photo of me and Jake from when we were still together. I had thrown all of those pictures away after the breakup. But here it was, sitting on my counter, like a reminder that Jake could come and go whenever he pleased. Like he was saying, "I'm always here, and there's nothing you can do about it." I packed a bag that night and went to stay with a friend. I haven't been back to the house since. I used to think I was pretty tech-savvy. I work in IT, so I know my way around computers, phones, and all that stuff. But none of that mattered when it came to Jess. We dated for about a year, and things were good at first. She was smart, probably the smartest person I'd ever met. She worked in cybersecurity, which seemed cool to me at the time. It was impressive, honestly, how much she knew. But after we broke up, I realized just how dangerous that knowledge could be. We had a pretty messy breakup. It wasn't one of those mutual, clean-cut endings. She got jealous a lot, even over small things, and it got to a point where I couldn't handle it anymore. She'd go through my phone, question every text, every DM. I get why she was insecure, but it was too much. So I ended it, figuring we'd just go our separate ways. A week after the breakup, my phone started acting weird. The battery was draining faster than usual, and my notifications were going off at odd times. I chalked it up to some background app draining resources, or maybe a glitch after an update. But then I started noticing other things. My email would show messages as read even though I hadn't opened them, and sometimes I'd get a notification for a text that I never actually received. It felt off, but again, I didn't think much of it at first. I was busy with work, and I figured I'd get around to sorting it out later. Things got stranger when I logged into my social media accounts. I started seeing activity that I hadn't done. Likes on posts, comments I didn't remember making, even follows for accounts I'd never heard of. I double-checked my history and settings, thinking maybe I'd been hacked. I changed my passwords, added two-factor authentication, did all the standard security stuff I'd tell any client to do. But the odd behavior didn't stop. One night, I came home from work and sat down at my computer to catch up on emails. As soon as I logged in, I noticed several emails had been marked as read that I hadn't even opened yet. It wasn't just junk mail either. Some were from work, others were personal, but they were all marked as if I'd already gone through them. I thought maybe there was some glitch with the server syncing, but deep down I knew something wasn't right. Then, I got a text from an unknown number. It wasn't threatening, but it said something like, "Nice try with the password change." I froze when I read it. No one should have known I had just changed my passwords, let alone mocked me for it. The realization hit me hard. Jess. It had to be her. She was the only person who knew me well enough and had the skills to pull this off. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe she wasn't doing anything illegal. Maybe she was just messing with me. I mean, it wasn't like she was sending threatening messages or showing up at my place. But the more I thought about it, the more it started to make sense. Jess knew how to break into systems, how to bypass security. She worked in cybersecurity. Hell, she probably built systems that were more secure than anything I had. I figured I'd confront her. I sent her a message trying to keep it calm, asking her if she was messing with my accounts. She didn't respond right away, but when she did, it was short and to the point. She said no, that she wasn't doing anything. I wanted to believe her, but there was something about the way she said it that didn't sit right with me. It felt too dismissive, like she wasn't even trying to hide it. The next day I went to the office and things got worse. I was in the middle of a meeting when my phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from my boss, sent to the entire team, about an important project update. But the weird thing was, I hadn't seen it before, and when I checked my inbox, it was already marked as read. I hadn't opened it. I couldn't even explain that one away as a glitch. Jess was still in my accounts, reading my emails, probably keeping tabs on my work life. I decided to wipe my phone. I did a factory reset, figuring that would at least clear out any spyware or apps she might have installed while we were together. I also wiped my laptop just to be safe, and I even switched to a new email provider. For a few days, everything seemed fine. My phone was running smoothly again, no weird notifications, no strange activity on my accounts. I thought maybe I'd finally gotten rid of whatever she had installed. But then the texts started again. Random numbers would send cryptic messages, things like, "You really think you can get rid of me?" or "I'll always know where you are." I couldn't prove it was Jess, but I knew. No one else would bother to go to this length. She was messing with me, toying with me, using her skills to make sure I knew she was still watching. The worst part was how subtle it all was. It wasn't like she was hacking into my bank account or stealing money. She was just there, always in the background, always a step ahead, reading my emails, checking my messages, knowing what I was doing without ever physically being there. It was maddening. One night, I was sitting on the couch scrolling through my phone when I got an alert from my home security system. It said the front door had been opened. I froze. I hadn't opened the door, and no one else was supposed to have access to the house. I quickly checked the camera feed, but it showed nothing. The door was closed, no one was outside, no signs of a break-in. It was just open for a second, then closed. I didn't know what to think. I changed the locks the next day, just in case. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the issue. Jess didn't need to physically break into my house to mess with me. She was using tech, and she was good at it. Way better than me. It was around that time that I started noticing strange things happening with my bank account. Small amounts of money were disappearing. Not enough to set off any major alarms, but enough that I noticed. A few dollars here, $10 there. I checked with the bank and they said all the transactions had been authorized. They showed me the details, my card, my account, everything was legit. But I knew I hadn't made those transactions. I tried everything, changing passwords, getting new credit cards, even switching banks. But the charges kept happening. Jess was still in my life, still finding ways to mess with me, even if I couldn't prove it. One night I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out what to do next. I couldn't go to the police. They wouldn't believe me. Jess hadn't done anything that I could definitively prove was illegal. I hadn't lost any major money, and there were no physical threats. It was all just invasive. It was like she was always there, a ghost in the machine, and there was nothing I could do to get rid of her. The final straw came when I started getting messages from my coworkers. They were asking me why I had been sending them weird emails, asking about private information and making inappropriate jokes. I hadn't sent those emails. I knew what was happening. Jess was in my work accounts now, trying to ruin my professional life just like she had messed with everything else. I went to my boss, explained the situation as best I could, but I could see the skepticism in his eyes. Who would believe that my ex-girlfriend was hacking into my life just to mess with me? It sounded ridiculous, even to me, but I knew it was real. I thought about moving, getting a new job, changing my name, but none of that seemed like it would help. Jess didn't need to be in the same city or even the same state to mess with me. She had access to everything, my phone, my computer, my life, and I had no idea how to stop her. I'm still living with it day by day. The emails, the messages, the random bank charges, they haven't stopped. I've done everything I can think of, but it's never enough. She's always there, lurking in the background, just out of reach. And I don't know if it will ever end. I broke up with Kyle 2 years ago, but it still feels like it was just yesterday. I don't know why I stayed with him as long as I did. Maybe it was because I didn't realize just how controlling he was until I was too deep into the relationship to get out easily. By the end, he wasn't just overbearing, he was obsessive. He'd show up at my job unannounced, blow up my phone with messages if I didn't respond within minutes, and track my location through social media. I guess I convinced myself it was just him being protective or worried, but that was a lie. I told myself to make things seem normal. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore and I broke things off. I moved to a new apartment in Seattle to get some distance, hoping that would be the end of it. I blocked him on everything, my phone, social media, all of it. It wasn't easy, but I wanted a fresh start. At first, things were good. I got a job at a marketing firm downtown, made some new friends, and started to feel like I could breathe again. The space away from Kyle was what I needed to feel like myself. But about 6 months after the breakup, things started to get strange. It wasn't anything dramatic at first, just little things that made me uneasy. Like, one night I was walking home from work and noticed a car parked across the street from my apartment building. I remember thinking the car looked familiar, but I couldn't place it. I told myself it was nothing. Seattle's a big city and people park all over the place. But it nagged at me. The next few weeks I started noticing the car more often. It would be parked near my building at odd hours, usually when I was coming or going from work. It was always in a different spot, sometimes on the street outside, sometimes in the parking lot of the grocery store a few blocks away. I didn't think too much of it until one night, as I was coming home late after grabbing drinks with some friends, I saw the car again. This time it was closer, parked just a few spots down from the entrance to my building. As I walked past it, I glanced inside, and that's when I saw him. Kyle was sitting behind the wheel watching me. I froze. We locked eyes for just a second before I hurried into my building, heart racing. I didn't stop until I was inside my apartment. The door locked behind me. I was shaking. Why was he here? How did he find me? I wanted to believe it was just a coincidence, that maybe he was in the area for something else and happened to park nearby. But deep down I knew that wasn't true. Kyle didn't do coincidences. He always knew where I was, what I was doing. He must have been following me for a while to figure out where I lived. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to overreact, but the idea that he was watching me freaked me out. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? He hadn't done anything illegal, he was just sitting in his car. They'd tell me to call back if he made a direct threat or tried to come inside my building. So I decided to wait it out, hoping he'd move on and disappear. But he didn't. Over the next few weeks I kept seeing the car around. Outside my apartment, near my office, even at the coffee shop I went to every morning. Sometimes he'd be in it, just sitting there, pretending not to notice me as I walked by. Other times the car would be empty, but I'd know it was his. I started getting paranoid, checking over my shoulder constantly, expecting to see him everywhere I went. One afternoon I was sitting at my desk at work when my phone buzzed. It was a text from a number I didn't recognize, but the message made my stomach drop. It said something like, "Nice dress today. Red looks good on you." I was wearing a red dress that day, but I hadn't posted anything online, and none of my coworkers would have sent a message like that. I deleted the text immediately and blocked the number, but I couldn't focus for the rest of the day. When I got home that evening, I looked around carefully before going inside. No sign of Kyle, no parked car, but I couldn't shake the fear that he was out there somewhere watching. I didn't know how he was keeping tabs on me. I'd blocked him on everything, stopped posting regularly on social media, even changed my number. But somehow, he always seemed to know what I was doing. The texts kept coming, each from a different number, always vague but unsettling. Things like, "You look tired this morning," or "Hope you had a good time at happy hour." Every time I blocked a number, a new one would pop up. It was like he was reminding me that no matter what I did, he was still in control. One evening, I came home from work and found a note slipped under my apartment door. It wasn't threatening, but it was in Kyle's handwriting. All it said was, "I miss you." My blood ran cold. He had been inside the building, he knew where I lived, and now he was getting closer. I checked the security camera footage from the lobby, but there was nothing. No sign of him. It was like he'd slipped in and out without anyone noticing. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every noise in the apartment made me jump. I kept thinking about the note, about how easily he could get inside. I started double-checking the locks on my windows and door, but it didn't help. The feeling of being vulnerable, of not being safe in my own home, was unbearable. A few days later, I saw him again. I was walking home from work, and there he was, standing across the street just watching. He didn't say anything, didn't move toward me, just stood there. I wanted to scream, to yell at him to leave me alone, but I couldn't. I was frozen in place, my mind racing with panic. Eventually, I turned and walked away as quickly as I could, taking a longer route home just to avoid him. After that, I stopped going out as much. I avoided walking alone and started taking cabs or ride shares whenever possible. I tried to keep a low profile, hoping that if I stayed out of sight, Kyle would get bored and move on. But he didn't. He was relentless. The texts kept coming, and the sightings became more frequent. It felt like he was everywhere, always lurking just out of reach, waiting for the right moment to make his next move. One night, I came home to find my apartment door slightly ajar. I knew I had locked it before leaving that morning, but now it was open. My heart pounded as I stepped inside, half expecting to find Kyle waiting for me. But the apartment was empty. Nothing was out of place, nothing missing. It was like someone had been there but hadn't touched anything. I couldn't prove it was him, but I knew it was. He was playing mind games, trying to make me feel unsafe, trying to get inside my head. I went to the police the next day. I told them about the texts, the note, the times I'd seen him near my apartment. But without any concrete evidence, there wasn't much they could do. They suggested I get a restraining order, but I knew that wouldn't stop him. If anything, it would only make him more determined. After that, I changed all the locks on my apartment and installed a security system. I thought maybe that would give me some peace of mind, but it didn't. I still felt like Kyle was out there, watching, waiting. Every time my phone buzzed with a new message, my stomach would drop. Every time I stepped outside, I was on edge, scanning the streets for any sign of him. Then one day, I came home to find a package waiting for me. It didn't have a return address, but it was clearly meant for me. I opened it cautiously, and inside was an old photo of Kyle and me from when we were still together. It was a picture I'd thrown out after the breakup, but here it was, back in my hands. Beneath the photo was a note that simply said, "Remember this?" I felt sick. How had he gotten this? Why was he doing this? I didn't have any answers, and I didn't know what to do next. The police weren't going to help, and moving again wasn't an option. I didn't have the money or the energy to start over. I still see Kyle sometimes, lingering in the background, always watching. I don't know what he's planning, or if he's planning anything at all. Maybe he just wants me to know that no matter what I do, he'll always be there, just a few steps behind, waiting for the right moment to step back into my life. I've learned to live with the fear, but it's exhausting. Every day feels like a battle just to keep going, to keep pretending that everything is normal when I know it isn't. Kyle isn't going away, and no matter what I do, I can't escape him. When I moved to Denver, it was supposed to be a fresh start. I just ended things with my ex, Tim, after years of an emotionally draining relationship. He was manipulative, controlling, and toward the end, it felt like he was always watching my every move. I'd had enough. So I packed up and left. I got a new job at a marketing firm, found a cozy little apartment, and was ready to move on. I didn't tell Tim where I was going. I blocked him on everything, changed my number, and cut all ties. I thought I was safe, that I could finally breathe again. For the first few months, everything seemed normal. My new apartment was in a quiet neighborhood, close to work, and just big enough for me. I loved the freedom of not having anyone constantly checking up on me. I started going out more, making new friends, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was in control of my life. It wasn't until about 6 months later that things started to get strange. It started with little things. At first, I noticed that some of my clothes were missing. Nothing major, just a couple of shirts and a jacket that I couldn't find. I assumed I'd misplaced them in the move or maybe left them at a friend's place, so I didn't think much of it. Then I started finding things in odd places around the apartment. I'd leave my keys on the kitchen counter only to find them in the bathroom the next morning. Or I'd come home from work and notice that a chair in the living room had been moved slightly. It was subtle, but it was enough to make me uneasy. One night I came home late from a work event and found that my front door was unlocked. I always lock it. Always. My heart started racing, but when I walked inside, nothing seemed out of place. I checked the windows and back door. Everything was closed and locked. I convinced myself that I must have forgotten to lock it in the morning. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I was careful about things like that. Still, I brushed it off and tried to ignore the creeping feeling that something was off. A few weeks later, I noticed the shower. It was subtle, but there were small puddles of water in the tub and the shower head had been adjusted. I hadn't taken a shower that morning. In fact, I'd been running late and barely had time to brush my teeth. I stood there, staring at the wet spots for a long time, trying to figure out how they could have gotten there. Maybe a pipe leak? But there was no sign of water damage and everything else seemed fine. After that, I started being more cautious. I checked the locks on all the doors and windows every night before going to bed. I even set up a couple of cheap cameras inside the apartment. Nothing fancy, just something to help me feel safer. I didn't tell anyone about what was going on. I didn't want to sound paranoid. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been inside my apartment. Then, one day, while I was cleaning out my closet, I found something that made my stomach drop. Tucked behind a box of old shoes, there was an air mattress. It was small, rolled up neatly, but definitely not mine. I hadn't bought an air mattress, and I had no reason to keep one in my closet. Next to it, there was a half-empty bag of snacks and a bottle of water. My hands started shaking. Someone had been living in my apartment, hiding in my closet. I called the police immediately. They came over and searched the place, but there was no sign of forced entry. No fingerprints, no clear evidence that anyone had been there besides me. The officers told me that it was possible someone had gotten in using a spare key or had found a way to enter while I was at work. They took a report, but there wasn't much else they could do. Without any solid proof, I felt helpless. I thought about moving, but my lease wasn't up for another 6 months, and I couldn't afford to break it. So I tried to tighten up security. I had the locks changed and upgraded my cameras. For a while it worked. Nothing strange happened, and I started to relax, thinking maybe it had all been in my head. But then it happened again. I came home from work one evening, and as soon as I walked in, I knew something was wrong. The air felt different, like someone had just been there. I checked the cameras, but the footage showed nothing. No one had entered while I was gone. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been in my space. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing noises, creaks and thumps coming from the ceiling. At first, I thought it was just the usual sounds of an old building settling, but it felt too deliberate, too rhythmic. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening. It wasn't until I got up and went to the living room that I realized the sound wasn't coming from above me. It was coming from the attic. I had never been up there. The attic wasn't technically part of my apartment. It was a crawl space used for storage, and the entrance was through a small hatch in the hallway ceiling. I didn't have anything stored up there, and the landlord had assured me it was sealed off. But as I stood in the hallway staring up at the hatch, I realized that it wasn't sealed at all. The cover was slightly ajar, just enough for someone to slip in and out. My heart was pounding. I grabbed a flashlight and a broom, my only makeshift weapon, and pulled down the hatch ladder. As I climbed up, I kept telling myself it was nothing, that I was just being paranoid. But when I shined the flashlight into the attic, I saw it. The air mattress, unrolled this time, along with a few other items. There was a small pile of clothes, some food wrappers, and a portable charger. Someone had been living in my attic. Not just for a day or two, but for weeks, maybe months. They'd been sneaking in and out of my apartment while I was at work, hiding out right above me. I called the police again, and they came back to search the attic. This time, they found more evidence, fingerprints, food, even a small notebook. But the person wasn't there. Whoever had been living up there had slipped away, probably while I was at work or asleep. The police took everything as evidence and assured me they'd do everything they could to find out who it was. But again, without any solid leads, there wasn't much they could do. I didn't feel safe in that apartment anymore. Every time I walked in the door, I'd look up at the attic hatch, expecting to see it open. I kept imagining that whoever had been living up there was still watching me, waiting for the right moment to come back. A few days later, I got a message. It was from an unknown number, but I knew immediately who it was from. The message said something like, "Miss me." My heart sank. I'd blocked Tim on everything, changed my number, moved cities, and he'd still found me. I realized then that it had been him all along. Tim had been the one living in my attic, sneaking in and out of my apartment, watching me. He must have figured out where I moved and found a way to get inside, hiding right under my nose for months. I felt sick. I packed up and left the apartment that night, crashing at a friend's place until I could figure out what to do next. I didn't tell my friend the whole story. I didn't want to scare them. But I made it clear that I couldn't stay at my apartment anymore. I knew I needed to move again, to get as far away from Tim as possible. But the thought of starting over, of constantly looking over my shoulder, was exhausting. I still don't know how he found me. Maybe he'd been tracking me the whole time, or maybe it was just dumb luck that he figured out where I lived. But now, even after moving to a new place, I can't shake the fear that he'll find me again. Every noise I hear at night, every creak in the walls makes me think that he's back, hiding somewhere nearby, just waiting for the right moment to slip in again. I never thought my ex would ruin my life the way she did. We broke up over 2 years ago, and I thought we had gone our separate ways. Her name is Chloe, and when we first got together, things were great. She was fun, charming, and we had a lot in common. But as time went on, her behavior became more possessive and obsessive. She'd get jealous over the smallest things, constantly accuse me of cheating, and she needed to know where I was at all times. It got to the point where I couldn't stand it anymore, so I broke things off. I thought that would be the end of it. We didn't have much contact after the breakup, aside from a few texts from her here and there that I mostly ignored. But eventually the texts stopped and I moved on. I met someone new, someone who was kind and supportive. Her name was Emma. We hit it off almost immediately and things started getting serious. After about a year of dating, I proposed. She said yes, and everything felt like it was falling into place. For the first time in a long while, I felt like my life was headed in the right direction. We planned the wedding for the following summer. We were excited. Emma was everything I could have hoped for. My family adored her, and her friends and mine blended easily. We had a small, close-knit group of people in our lives, and we both felt lucky to have found each other. We didn't want a huge wedding, just something simple and intimate with our closest friends and family in Denver where we lived. Everything seemed perfect. But then, about 3 months before the wedding, things started getting strange. Emma became distant. She wasn't as excited about wedding planning anymore, and she'd brush off conversations about the future. At first, I thought she was just stressed about the whole process. Weddings are stressful after all, and maybe she was feeling overwhelmed. I tried to talk to her about it, but every time I brought it up, she'd shut down. She'd give vague answers like she wasn't sure about things anymore. It was confusing because nothing had happened between us to warrant such a sudden change. Around the same time, I started hearing rumors, small, insidious things that seemed to come out of nowhere. Friends of mine would ask me if everything was okay with Emma and me, saying they'd heard things. At first, I brushed it off as wedding gossip, but the rumors kept growing. Someone said they'd heard that Emma was having doubts about the marriage, that she was considering calling it off. Another friend said they'd heard I had done something to upset her, though they couldn't say exactly what it was. I confronted Emma about the rumors, but she denied everything. She said she didn't know where they were coming from and assured me that she still wanted to marry me. But her behavior didn't match her words. She became more withdrawn, spending less time with me and more time with her friends. She'd cancel plans at the last minute, say she was too tired, or make excuses about work. I tried to be patient, but I could feel her slipping away, and I didn't know why. A month before the wedding, things reached a breaking point. Emma came home one night and told me she needed to talk. She sat me down and said she didn't think she could go through with the wedding. She was crying, clearly upset, and I was blindsided. I asked her why, what had changed, but she couldn't give me a clear answer. She just kept saying that things didn't feel right, that she had doubts about me, about us. When I pressed her, she admitted that she had heard things, rumors that I had been unfaithful to her. I was stunned. I'd never cheated on Emma, not once. I asked her where she was hearing this from, but she wouldn't say. She just kept insisting that people had told her things, that she didn't know what to believe anymore. I tried to reassure her, told her I loved her and would never betray her like that, but it was like she had already made up her mind. A week later, she called off the wedding. I was devastated. Everything had fallen apart so quickly, and I couldn't understand why. It felt like I had been living in some kind of nightmare, like everything I had built with Emma had crumbled for reasons I couldn't control. The worst part was the rumors. People kept coming to me, telling me they had heard about the breakup and asking if it was true that I had been cheating on Emma. I had no idea where these lies were coming from, but they were spreading fast. Then, I started getting messages from unknown numbers. They weren't threatening, but they were cryptic, like someone was toying with me. One message said, "Now she knows who you really are." Another said, "You didn't think you could hide it forever?" I was losing my mind. I hadn't done anything, and yet it felt like the whole world believed I was some kind of monster. My reputation was ruined, and I couldn't even defend myself because I didn't know who was behind it all. It wasn't until a few weeks after the wedding was supposed to happen that I finally figured it out. A mutual friend of mine and Chloe's reached out to me and said they needed to tell me something. They said they'd been in contact with Chloe recently, and during one of their conversations, Chloe had let it slip that she had been spreading rumors about me. She'd been telling people I was unfaithful to Emma, sending anonymous messages to Emma herself, planting doubts in her mind. I felt sick. It all made sense now. Chloe hadn't let go. She had found a way to destroy my relationship from a distance without ever confronting me directly. She knew exactly how to manipulate people, how to plant seeds of doubt, how to ruin my life without ever showing her face. I had underestimated how far she would go to get back at me. I tried reaching out to Emma to explain what had really happened, but she wouldn't respond. She had already cut me off, blocked me on everything. As far as she was concerned, the damage had been done and there was no going back. My friends, well, some of them still believed me, but others had distanced themselves too. The rumors had done their job. Chloe had turned people against me without ever stepping into the picture. I couldn't prove any of it. Chloe had been smart, careful. There was no paper trail, no messages directly linking her to the rumors. I could tell people what my friend had told me, but without any evidence, it was just my word against hers. And in the end, that wasn't enough. People believed what they wanted to believe, and Chloe had painted me as the villain. My life has never been the same since. I haven't dated anyone seriously since Emma. It's hard to trust anyone now. I keep thinking about how easy it was for Chloe to ruin everything, to slip into the background and pull the strings without anyone knowing. She didn't need to come near me to destroy me. She just needed to plant the right lies in the right places, and everything else fell apart on its own. I still live in Denver, but I avoid the places Emma and I used to go. It's too painful to think about what could have been, knowing that it was all taken from me by someone I thought I had left behind. I've tried to move on, but I don't know if I ever will. Every time I hear a rumor about myself, even if it's something small, I wonder if Chloe is still out there, still finding ways to make my life miserable from a distance. I guess that's the scariest part, knowing that someone can ruin your life without ever laying a hand on you. I never thought my ex, Amanda, would go as far as she did. We were together for a little over 2 years, and honestly, the relationship was fine for the first year. She was smart, outgoing, and we clicked in a way that felt easy. But as time went on, things started to change. She became more controlling, constantly needing to know where I was and who I was with. At first, I brushed it off, thinking she was just being protective, but then it got worse. She'd get jealous if I so much as talked to a female coworker, and it felt like everything I did was under a microscope. It was suffocating. I broke up with her about 1.5 years ago, and she didn't take it well. She kept calling, texting, showing up at my place unannounced, trying to talk me into getting back together. I blocked her on my phone, on social media, everywhere I could, but she always found a way to reach out, using new numbers, fake accounts, even mutual friends. It was exhausting, but eventually, after a few months, she seemed to move on. I thought that was the end of it. Then strange things started happening. It was small at first, almost unnoticeable. I was applying for jobs, trying to move up in my field. I had a good amount of experience and a decent resume, and I'd been getting interviews here and there, but suddenly, I stopped hearing back from places that had seemed interested. I didn't think much of it at the time. Job hunting is always hit or miss, but it was frustrating. I had applied to several places around Denver, and each one seemed to go cold right after expressing initial interest. I kept applying, but after weeks of silence from companies that should have gotten back to me, I decided to check my email account. I'd been using Gmail for years, but when I logged in to check for any replies, I noticed something weird. There were emails marked as read that I hadn't opened. Some of them were from recruiters or hiring managers, emails I had never seen before. A couple had been deleted completely, but I found them in the trash folder. Messages about scheduling interviews, offers for second-round meetings. It didn't make sense. I hadn't touched those emails. Someone had been in my account. I immediately changed my password and added two-factor authentication, thinking maybe I'd been hacked. I didn't want to believe Amanda was behind it, but she was the only person who knew my passwords. I'd never thought twice about sharing them when we were together, but now I was regretting it. Still, it seemed like too much of a stretch. Why would she go through my emails? What would she even get out of it? I figured it was just bad luck, maybe a phishing scam that got into my account, and after changing the passwords things would go back to normal, but they didn't. Over the next few weeks, more weird things started happening. I was using LinkedIn to network and apply for jobs, but I noticed my profile had been changed. Not drastically, but enough to make me look less professional. Typos in my bio, weird phrases added to my work experience, things I never put there. I also started getting odd messages from recruiters who had clearly been contacted by someone pretending to be me. They'd ask follow-up questions to things I hadn't said, or respond to messages I hadn't sent. I locked down my LinkedIn, updated my passwords again, and tried to move on. But things just kept getting worse. I missed out on 2 job offers because I didn't get the emails in time, and when I tried to explain the situation to the companies, they were skeptical. It didn't help that my reputation seemed to be taking a hit. I'd get messages from people in my industry saying they'd heard rumors about me, things I hadn't done, saying I was difficult to work with, unreliable, or even inappropriate in emails. I didn't know where any of it was coming from, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was trying to sabotage me. The final straw came when I got a message from a company I had really been excited about. They'd offered me an interview, and I had responded with all the information they asked for. But then I got an email from them saying that they were rescinding the offer because of my inappropriate behavior and follow-up emails. I had no idea what they were talking about. I hadn't sent any follow-up emails after the initial scheduling. I managed to get them to send me copies of the emails, and my stomach dropped when I saw them. They were from my email account, but I hadn't written a single word. The emails were unprofessional, rude, and borderline offensive, something I'd never say or write to anyone. I knew then that it had to be Amanda. She was smart. She worked in tech, and she knew her way around systems. I don't know how long she had been in my accounts, but it was clear she had been watching everything, messing with my emails, sabotaging my job search. She had made sure that every opportunity slipped through my fingers, all while pretending to be me. I called her. I don't know what I expected, maybe some kind of confession. But she denied everything. She played dumb, acting like she had no idea what I was talking about. I hung up, furious and helpless. I had no proof it was her, and I didn't know how to fix the damage she had done. I tried to rebuild my reputation, reached out to people to explain what had happened, but it was like trying to put together shattered glass. Some people believed me, but others didn't. The job market in my industry is tight, and every opportunity counts. Losing out on so many interviews, having my name dragged through the mud, it took a toll. I started looking for new ways to secure my accounts, new passwords, different email services. I thought if I could just block her out, things would get better. But it wasn't just my professional life she was after. One day, I logged into my bank account and noticed some small, unauthorized transactions. A few dollars here and there, nothing major, but it was strange. I called the bank and they assured me the transactions were legitimate, authorized with my account details. That's when it hit me. Amanda must have gotten into my financial accounts too. She had all my passwords from when we were together. Even though I'd changed them, I couldn't be sure she hadn't installed spyware on my devices. I wiped my phone and computer, changed everything again, and called the bank to freeze my accounts. By this point, I was exhausted. It felt like no matter what I did, Amanda was always a step ahead, always finding a way to stay in control. It wasn't just about getting back at me for the breakup anymore. It was about ruining my life. She didn't need to send threatening messages or confront me directly. She was destroying everything from a distance, quietly, methodically. I went to the police, but without concrete proof that she was behind it, there wasn't much they could do. I couldn't prove she was the one who had hacked my accounts or impersonated me online. All I had were suspicions, and that wasn't enough. I filed a report, but it felt pointless. I started distancing myself from everyone. I stopped applying for jobs, stopped going out with friends, stopped trusting anyone. Every time I got an email or a text, I worried it was Amanda, lurking behind the scenes, ready to sabotage me again. I felt trapped, like there was no way out. My finances were a mess, my career was in ruins, and I was constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering what Amanda would do next. I hadn't seen her in person since the breakup, but it felt like she was always there, in the background, pulling the strings. I couldn't shake the feeling that no matter what I did, she'd find a way to keep screwing with my life. I don't know how to fix things. I've tried everything, changing passwords, wiping devices, even switching phone numbers, but it doesn't matter. Amanda knows too much, and she's too good at covering her tracks. I'm stuck, waiting for the next blow, wondering how far she's willing to go to ruin me. I never thought my life would turn into this. A few years ago, everything was normal. I was married, had a beautiful daughter, and lived in a quiet neighborhood in St. Louis. Things started falling apart when my ex-wife Anna and I began having problems. The relationship wasn't perfect, no marriage is, but toward the end it became unbearable. We argued about everything, and it felt like no matter what I did, it was never enough for her. The divorce was messy. I tried to keep it civil, mostly because I wanted to make sure things stayed normal for our daughter Mia. She was only 4 when we split, and the last thing I wanted was to drag her into the chaos. But Anna? She seemed to take the divorce as a personal vendetta. From the moment we filed, it became clear that she wasn't going to make things easy. She was angry, bitter and determined to make me pay for leaving. It wasn't about money or property. She knew I wasn't wealthy. What she wanted was Mia, and she was willing to do whatever it took to keep her from me. The custody battle was the worst part. I knew I had every right to be in Mia's life, but Anna kept trying to make me out to be the bad guy. She filed for full custody, claiming that I wasn't fit to be a father, that I was unreliable, even dangerous. She made up stories, saying that I had a temper, that I had been neglectful during our marriage. None of it was true, but she had a way of twisting things to make them sound believable. At first, I tried to reason with her, thinking we could come to some sort of agreement, but every time we got close to a compromise, she'd pull back and make new accusations. The courts got involved, and that's when things really started to spiral. She'd cancel visitation at the last minute, telling me Mia wasn't feeling well or that they had other plans. It became almost impossible to see my own daughter. I'd drive all the way to Anna's house, only to be turned away at the door with some excuse. I didn't want to go through the courts, but I had no choice. I filed to enforce the visitation rights that were already in place. I thought that once the legal system was involved, Anna wouldn't be able to play these games anymore. I was wrong. The first time she made a false police report, I was shocked. I had shown up to pick Mia up for the weekend just like I was supposed to, and as soon as I got there, Anna called the police, claiming I was harassing her and that I had threatened her. The police came, and I had to stand there trying to explain that I was just there for a court-ordered visit with my daughter. Luckily, the cops didn't arrest me, but Anna made a scene, screaming and crying, making it look like I was some kind of threat to her. I could tell they didn't know who to believe, and that's what terrified me the most. After that, things only got worse. She started filing more complaints, claiming I was stalking her, that I was abusive, that Mia was scared of me. I hadn't done any of those things, but in her mind it didn't matter. She was using the system against me, knowing full well how slow and broken it can be. The court started to take her side, at least initially, putting temporary holds on my visitation while they investigated her claims. It didn't matter that they were baseless. Each time, it set me back further in the fight to see my daughter. Every time I tried to fight back legally, Anna would escalate. She'd file more reports, dragging Mia to therapy sessions, claiming that she was traumatized by spending time with me. Mia was only 5 at this point, and I could tell she didn't understand what was happening. Whenever I did get to see her, she was quieter than usual, distant. Anna was poisoning her against me. She'd tell Mia things, lies about me, about why we weren't together anymore, and Mia would ask me questions that broke my heart, like why I didn't love her enough to stay or why I made her mom cry. I tried so hard to be patient, to do things the right way. I hired a lawyer, documented every interaction, saved every text and email. But Anna knew exactly how to push my buttons. She'd make plans for me to see Mia and then cancel at the last minute. She'd file reports with Child Protective Services claiming I was neglecting Mia, saying I had hit her. Of course, there was no evidence, but that didn't matter. Every time a report was filed, I was under investigation again. They'd send social workers to my house, interview me like I was some kind of criminal. It was humiliating, and worse, it was devastating Mia. She was caught in the middle of it all, and it was destroying her. Every time I saw her, it was like she was being pulled further away from me. I couldn't just be her dad anymore. I had to constantly prove that I was a good father, and every minute I spent fighting Anna's lies was a minute taken away from Mia. Then Anna started making threats about moving. She said she was thinking about taking Mia and leaving St. Louis altogether, moving to a different state. I knew she couldn't legally do that without my permission, but it didn't stop the fear from gnawing at me. If she moved, it would be even harder to see Mia, even harder to fight for custody. I felt trapped, like I was losing this battle no matter how hard I fought. One night, after months of back-and-forth court filings, police reports, and missed visitations, I got a call from my lawyer. He told me that Anna had filed for an emergency custody hearing. She was claiming that I'd been physically abusive to Mia during one of our last visits. I was stunned. There was absolutely no truth to it. Mia had been fine when she was with me. But the way my lawyer spoke, I could hear the concern in his voice. Even though the claims were false, it didn't matter. The court had already issued an order suspending my visitation rights until the hearing. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. I knew what Anna was doing. She was trying to cut me out of Mia's life completely. If she could convince the court that I was dangerous, she'd get full custody and I'd never see Mia again. I tried calling Anna, but she wouldn't answer. I sent messages, emails, anything I could think of, begging her to stop, to think about what she was doing to Mia, but she didn't care. This wasn't about Mia. It was about punishing me for leaving her. She wanted control, and she was using our daughter as a weapon. The weeks leading up to the hearing were the worst of my life. I was terrified that Anna's lies would stick, that the court would believe her. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus at work. I kept thinking about all the moments I was missing with Mia. School events, weekends at the park, bedtime stories, all the normal things that a dad is supposed to do. Anna had taken that from me, and now she was trying to take away the last bit of time I had left with her. When the day of the hearing finally came, I felt like I was walking into a nightmare. Anna sat across from me in the courtroom, calm and composed, while I was a wreck. She told the judge all these terrible things about me. How I'd been violent, how Mia was afraid of me. She cried, painted herself as the perfect mother who was just trying to protect her daughter from an unfit father. I felt sick, but I couldn't show it. I had to keep it together, had to focus on proving my innocence. My lawyer fought hard for me, pointing out the inconsistencies in Anna's story, the lack of evidence. He brought up all the times Anna had filed false reports, the police visits where nothing had been found. It was all out in the open now. Anna's lies, her manipulation, the lengths she'd gone to in order to keep Mia away from me. But the damage had already been done. The court didn't reinstate my visitation rights right away. Instead, they ordered a full investigation, which meant more months of waiting, more time away from Mia. I left the courthouse that day feeling defeated. Even though the truth was on my side, it didn't matter. Anna had dragged me through hell, and Mia was the one paying the price. I had no idea how long it would take for the investigation to wrap up, or if I'd ever get my time with Mia back. I still don't know how this is going to end. Every day feels like a battle, and every time I see Mia, it's like she's slipping further away from me. Anna's still out there, still finding ways to twist the system to keep me from being a father to my own daughter. I keep fighting, but it feels like I'm constantly losing ground. I broke up with Vanessa over a year ago, but it still feels like it's just beneath the surface, bubbling up every now and then when I least expect it. We were together for about 2 years, and for most of that time I was blind to how controlling she was. She never got physical, but the mental and emotional games she played messed with my head in ways I didn't even understand until much later. It wasn't always obvious, just little things at first, like needing to know where I was all the time, who I was talking to, or why I wasn't responding to her texts quickly enough. By the end, I couldn't take it anymore. I was constantly on edge, walking on eggshells, trying to keep her calm and not set off her jealousy or paranoia. I felt like I was losing my mind, so I finally broke it off. It wasn't pretty. She called me a coward, a liar, accused me of things I hadn't done. It was messy, but I cut ties completely after that. Blocked her number, deleted her from all social media, everything. For a few months, things were normal. I tried to move on, started going to therapy to work through some of the stuff that had happened, and felt like I was finally getting my life back on track. I even moved to a new apartment on the other side of Phoenix to start fresh. I figured that was the end of it. But then she started showing up. It wasn't right away, and at first I wasn't even sure it was her. I'd be at the gym or out with friends, and I'd catch a glimpse of someone who looked like her just for a second. I'd look again, and the person would be gone, or they'd be far enough away that I couldn't tell if it was actually her. I brushed it off as paranoia, my brain playing tricks on me because I was still processing everything. But then it became harder to ignore. One night I was out at a bar with some friends. It was a Saturday and we were just hanging out, nothing special. I went to the bathroom, and as I was walking back to our table, I saw her. Vanessa was sitting at the bar, a few feet away from where we were. She didn't look at me, didn't acknowledge me, but she was there. I stopped dead in my tracks, just staring. It wasn't a coincidence. Phoenix is a big city, and she had no reason to be at that bar. I didn't say anything to my friends, I just tried to enjoy the rest of the night, but I couldn't shake the unease. I left early, saying I wasn't feeling well. When I got home, I locked the door and checked all the windows. I stayed up late that night, waiting for a knock at the door or something, but nothing happened. The next morning, I convinced myself it was a fluke, that maybe she had just happened to be there. But the sightings kept happening. A week later, I saw her again, this time at the grocery store. She wasn't close, but I could see her in the parking lot, standing by her car. She wasn't shopping, wasn't doing anything, just standing there like she was waiting. I rushed through my shopping, keeping my head down, and when I left the store, she was gone. I started getting anxious every time I left my apartment, wondering if I'd see her again. I couldn't go anywhere without scanning the crowd, looking for her face. It was like she was always just a few steps behind me, never close enough to talk to, but always there. Then came the phone calls. At first, they were from blocked numbers, just silence on the other end of the line. I'd pick up, say hello a few times, and after a few seconds, they'd hang up. It wasn't every day, but it happened enough that I knew it wasn't random. I stopped answering calls from unknown numbers, but the calls kept coming. Voicemails too, long, empty messages with no sound, just dead air. I changed my number, but it didn't stop. She found my new number somehow. It wasn't just the calls, though. One day I came home from work and found a note taped to my front door. There wasn't much on it, just a few words. "I'm still here." I tore it down and threw it away, hoping it was just a prank. But deep down, I knew it was from Vanessa. It was her handwriting. I went to the police, but there wasn't much they could do. The officer I talked to was sympathetic, but without any proof that she was physically threatening me, there wasn't much they could pursue. They said I could file a restraining order, but even that wouldn't stop her from harassing me from a distance. She hadn't made any threats, hadn't done anything illegal, just enough to make me feel like she was always there, watching, but never enough to cross a line. It got to the point where I was afraid to leave my apartment. Every time I went out, I half expected to see her somewhere nearby, lurking in the background, watching me from across the street. I stopped going to the gym, stopped hanging out with friends as much. I didn't want to explain what was going on, didn't want them to think I was paranoid or overreacting, so I just stayed inside as much as I could, trying to avoid her completely. One night, I came home late from work and found something new. My apartment door was unlocked. I always lock it. Always. My stomach dropped, and I stood there for a long time, just staring at the doorknob, wondering if I should go inside. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? Nothing had been taken, nothing was damaged, but I knew someone had been inside. I finally went in, walking through the apartment carefully, checking every room. Everything looked normal at first glance, but then I noticed a small change. One of the picture frames on my bookshelf had been moved, just slightly. It was a photo of me and my family, and I always kept it in the same spot. Now, it was angled differently, like someone had picked it up, looked at it, and put it back down. I sat down on the couch, my mind racing. Had Vanessa been inside? How had she gotten in? I checked the windows again, made sure the door was locked, but it didn't make me feel any safer. Someone had been in my space, touched my things, and I had no idea how long they'd been there or if they'd come back. After that, I started getting paranoid about everything. I bought new locks for the doors, installed a security camera outside my apartment, and changed my number again. For a while, things calmed down. The calls stopped, and I didn't see Vanessa anywhere. I thought maybe she had finally moved on, that the harassment was over. But then the messages started again. This time, it wasn't phone calls. I'd wake up in the morning to find notes slipped under my door, small, handwritten notes with cryptic messages. "You can't hide forever. I know where you are." There was never a name, never anything to directly link it to Vanessa, but I knew it was her. The worst part was the silence. She never confronted me directly, never made any threats in person. It was all in the background, like she was reminding me that she could be there anytime she wanted, but without actually showing her face. I couldn't prove any of it. Couldn't go to the police and say that these small things were enough to make me feel unsafe. It felt like I was slowly unraveling, second-guessing every sound, every shadow, every knock on the door. One night I was sitting on the couch scrolling through my phone when I got a message from a new number. It was a picture of my front door, taken from the hallway just outside. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at it. I jumped up, ran to the door and yanked it open, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty. I don't know how long I stood there, waiting for something to happen, but eventually I went back inside and locked the door. I checked the security camera footage, but it showed nothing. Just a brief moment of static right around the time the picture was sent. I don't know if she had somehow tampered with the camera or if it was just a glitch, but it didn't matter. She was there just outside my door and I had no idea what she was planning. I haven't seen Vanessa in person for months now, but the harassment hasn't stopped. The calls, the messages, the notes, they come and go in waves. Sometimes there's a lull, and I start to think maybe it's over. But then, out of nowhere, she'll pop back up, reminding me that she's still out there, still watching. It's like she's playing a game, pushing just enough to keep me on edge, but never enough for me to do anything about it. I've thought about moving again, but I don't know if that would solve anything. She's always found a way to get to me, no matter where I go. A few months after breaking up with my ex, Kate, I thought I was finally moving on. We had dated for a little over a year, and by the end it was clear that things weren't going to work out. She was unpredictable, sweet and loving one moment, then angry and distant the next. I didn't fully realize it while we were together, but she had this strange need to be in control of everything. When I ended things, she didn't take it well. For weeks after the breakup, she called, sent texts, and even showed up at my apartment a couple of times. I tried to be polite at first, explaining that it was over, but eventually I had to block her. For a while, things were quiet. I focused on work, spent more time with friends, and tried to get back to a normal routine. I wasn't really looking for anything serious, but one night I was bored and decided to download a dating app. It seemed harmless enough, just swiping through profiles, chatting with a few people. After a couple of weeks, I matched with someone who seemed different from the rest. Her name was Alyssa. She was smart, funny, and we clicked almost immediately. The conversation felt natural, and before I knew it, we were texting each other constantly. She told me she lived in a different part of the city, just outside of Chicago in a suburb about 30 minutes from me, and was looking for someone who was also serious about getting to know people. We talked for a few weeks before she suggested meeting in person. I was excited. It had been a while since I'd felt this way about anyone, and I was ready to move on from Kate for good. Alyssa and I agreed to meet at a small coffee shop downtown on a Saturday afternoon. I remember being nervous but excited, checking my phone constantly as I got ready. But when I got to the coffee shop, she wasn't there. I figured she might be running late, so I ordered a coffee and waited. After about 20 minutes, I sent her a text asking if she was still coming. No response. I waited another half hour, but still nothing. I checked my phone again, but there were no missed calls or messages. At this point, I figured she had ghosted me. Disappointed, I left the coffee shop and headed home. Later that evening, I checked my phone again. Still nothing from Alyssa. I opened the dating app, but her profile was gone. I couldn't find her anywhere, and all our previous messages had disappeared. It didn't make sense. People get cold feet all the time, but why would she delete everything without a word? I spent the next couple of days trying to put it out of my mind. Maybe she just wasn't who she said she was. Maybe it was some scam, and I was lucky I didn't get more involved. I had almost convinced myself it was no big deal when I got an email. The subject line was just, "Sorry." I opened it, and my stomach dropped. The email was from Alyssa, or at least it was from the same email address she had given me when we first started talking. The message was short and strange. She apologized for not showing up to the coffee shop and said that she wasn't ready to meet anyone after all. She mentioned something about her personal life being more complicated than she had let on. At the bottom of the email, she wrote, "Maybe it's for the best. You wouldn't have liked me anyway." Something about the tone felt off. It didn't seem like the Alyssa I had been talking to for weeks. But again, I figured it was just some elaborate ghosting move. People do weird things online, right? So I ignored it. That's when things started to get strange. A couple of days later, I got another message, this time a text from an unknown number. It was just a simple, "Hey, it's Alyssa. Sorry about the coffee shop." I replied, asking what had happened, but all I got back was, "Maybe we can still meet up sometime." I didn't feel right about it, but part of me still wanted an explanation, so I asked her if we could talk. No response. I tried calling the number, but it went straight to voicemail. That night, I was lying in bed, thinking about the whole situation, when I got another text from the same number. This time, it was just a photo, a picture of me from that afternoon at the coffee shop. I was sitting by the window, looking down at my phone. I hadn't noticed anyone taking pictures of me while I was there, and the realization sent a chill through me. Someone had been watching me. I jumped out of bed and checked my apartment's locks, making sure everything was secure. I wanted to believe that maybe the photo was a coincidence. Maybe someone else had been at the coffee shop and took the picture. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The next day, I started getting more messages. Whoever was texting me knew things they shouldn't. They mentioned the clothes I had worn the day before, what time I had left for work, and even the route I had taken to get home. It was too much. I blocked the number and decided to report it to the police, but they didn't take it seriously. They said it was probably just some prank or an online scam, nothing to worry about. I knew better, but I didn't have any proof of who was behind it. A week later, I got another email, this time from a different address. The message was longer, and it was clear now that the person behind this wasn't Alyssa at all. The email talked about how foolish I was to believe I could move on so easily, how I had hurt someone deeply, and how they had been watching me ever since. It didn't take long to figure out who was really behind it. It was Kate. She had created the fake profile. She had been Alyssa the entire time, stringing me along, waiting for the right moment to mess with me. The realization made me feel sick. I had let her back into my life without even knowing it, and now she was playing games with me again. The messages became more frequent after that. She started sending emails and texts from different numbers and accounts, each one more unnerving than the last. Sometimes they were cryptic, telling me that she was watching. Other times they were angry, accusing me of things I hadn't done, blaming me for the end of our relationship. But the worst ones were the photos. Pictures of me, taken from a distance, like she was always nearby, always watching. I tried changing my number again, deactivating my social media, everything I could think of to cut her off. But every time I thought I had gotten rid of her, she found a way back in. New numbers, new accounts, always popping up when I least expected it. She never physically confronted me, never made direct threats, but the psychological toll was unbearable. One night I was heading home after a long day at work, and as I pulled into my apartment complex, I saw her car parked a few spaces away from mine. She wasn't inside, but I recognized the plates. I hadn't seen Kate in months, but knowing she had been here so close to where I lived made my heart race. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I found a note taped to my door. It didn't say much, just, "I'll always find you." I called the police again, but without any clear evidence that she was doing something illegal, they couldn't do much. They suggested I get a restraining order, but I knew it wouldn't stop her. She was too smart for that. She knew how to stay just out of reach, how to keep pushing without ever crossing the line. Now I don't know what to do. Kate is still out there. Every time I think I've cut her off, she finds a new way to remind me that she's still watching, still waiting. I haven't been on a date since Alyssa. I'm too scared to trust anyone online, too paranoid that it might be Kate again, pulling the strings. I'm trapped in this cycle of fear, always wondering when she'll show up next, always questioning every message, every call, every person I meet. I don't know how to make it stop. Following the breakup with my ex, Noah, I moved to a new city to start fresh. It wasn't like the relationship had been violent or anything like that, but it was suffocating. Noah was controlling, obsessive, and he had this weird ability to make me feel like everything was my fault. Every argument, every little thing I did that he didn't like, he'd twist it until I was the one apologizing. I stayed longer than I should have, but eventually, I had enough. I packed up my things, moved to Chicago, and did my best to erase him from my life. For a few months, things were good. I found a nice apartment in a quiet neighborhood and started a new job that kept me busy. I made friends, explored the city, and it felt like I was finally putting everything behind me. I even met someone new, David. He was the complete opposite of Noah. Kind, thoughtful, not overbearing in the slightest. Things were moving slowly, but I liked that. It felt healthy, like I could breathe again. One day I came home from work to find a package on my doorstep. It wasn't unusual. I had ordered a few things online recently and I figured it was just one of them. But when I picked it up, I noticed something strange. There was no return address, and the handwriting on the label looked familiar, though I couldn't place it at first. I shrugged it off, took it inside, and opened it. Inside was a small box filled with random items, old photos of me and Noah, letters I had written him during our relationship, and a few little trinkets he had given me over the years. I hadn't seen any of these things since I moved. I had thrown them away, or at least I thought I had. My heart started racing. How had he gotten these? Why were they here? I tried to convince myself that maybe I had accidentally packed some of these things when I moved and just didn't remember. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. I had been careful to get rid of everything that reminded me of Noah. And even if I had missed something, how would it end up in this box? I didn't want to think about it, so I shoved the box into the back of my closet and tried to move on. A few days later, another package arrived. This one was smaller, but when I opened it, I felt sick. It was a photograph of me and Noah at my old apartment back when we were still together. It was one of the photos I had thrown out after the breakup. On the back of the photo, written in that same familiar handwriting, was a single sentence. Remember this? I was frozen. There was no reason for Noah to still have this photo, let alone send it to me. I hadn't spoken to him since I left, and I had blocked him on everything: social media, phone, email, all of it. This wasn't just some random coincidence. He was trying to get back into my life, but I had no idea how far he would go. Over the next few weeks, more packages started arriving. Each one contained something more disturbing than the last. Old love letters, items I had long forgotten about, and even things I thought I had lost during the move. One package contained a scarf that I had left behind at my old apartment. Another had a keychain that Noah had given me for our first anniversary. It was like he was sending me little pieces of our past, trying to remind me of what we had. But instead of feeling nostalgic, I felt like I was being haunted. I tried to talk to my friends about it, but most of them brushed it off, saying it was probably some weird way of Noah trying to reach out, like a twisted version of closure. David didn't seem too worried either. He thought Noah was just being a creep and that I should throw the stuff away and move on. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. These weren't just random gifts or old memories. He was sending me things I hadn't seen in years, things I had gotten rid of or left behind. It felt deliberate, like he was trying to mess with my head. One morning, I found a package at my door that made everything worse. Inside was a journal. It wasn't mine. It was one I had never seen before. When I opened it, the pages were filled with handwritten entries, all in Noah's handwriting. The entries were dated from the last few months, long after I had left. They were full of disturbing thoughts, obsessive ramblings about me, about how he had been watching me. He wrote about things he couldn't have known, places I had gone, people I had seen. He even mentioned David by name, describing him as some kind of intruder in our relationship. I felt sick. Noah wasn't just trying to reconnect or get back at me for leaving. He was stalking me, watching my every move. Somehow, he had found out where I lived, who I was seeing, and what I was doing, and I had no idea how. I went to the police with the journal and the packages, hoping they would take it seriously, but they didn't. Without any direct threats, there wasn't much they could do. They told me to document everything and to file a restraining order if things escalated. That was it. I felt helpless. Noah wasn't threatening me outright, but the constant reminders that he was watching me were enough to make me feel like I was losing my mind. After that, I became paranoid. Every time I left my apartment, I looked over my shoulder, half expecting to see Noah lurking somewhere nearby. I stopped going to the places I used to frequent, started taking different routes to work, and avoided being alone as much as possible. But no matter how careful I was, the packages kept coming. He was relentless, sending me more of our past, each box filled with memories I didn't want to revisit. One night, I came home from work to find my front door unlocked. I always made sure to lock it before I left, and I knew I hadn't forgotten. My heart was pounding as I slowly opened the door and stepped inside. Everything looked normal at first, but as I walked through the apartment, I noticed small things had been moved. My books were slightly out of place, the pillows on the couch were rearranged, and the picture frames on the wall were crooked. I rushed to check my closet, where I had shoved the first box Noah had sent. It was gone. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the empty space where the box had been. Someone had been in my apartment, and I didn't need to guess who. I called the police again, but there was no sign of forced entry, no evidence that anyone had been inside. They couldn't do anything. After that, I stopped sleeping. Every noise in my apartment set me on edge. I started leaving lights on at night, hoping that would make me feel safer, but it didn't. I knew Noah had been inside, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he would come back. A few days later, I got another package. This time, it wasn't something from our past. Inside was a photo of me, taken recently. I was walking down the street near my apartment, completely unaware that someone had been following me. On the back of the photo, in that same familiar handwriting, was a message. "I miss you." I couldn't take it anymore. I packed a bag and left that night, staying with a friend for a few days while I figured out what to do. I knew I couldn't stay in Chicago anymore, not with Noah constantly watching me, not with him breaking into my apartment and leaving these sick reminders that he was always there. I haven't gone back to my apartment since. I don't know if Noah is still sending packages, if he's still watching, or if he's waiting for me to come back. After I broke up with Rose, I thought the worst of it was behind me. It had been a messy breakup, but I figured that once we went our separate ways, life would move on. We'd been together for almost 2 years, and the relationship had gotten toxic toward the end. Rose was possessive, always needing to know where I was, who I was with, and what I was doing. She didn't trust me, no matter how many times I tried to reassure her. I guess it shouldn't have come as a surprise when things fell apart, but I wasn't prepared for what happened after. When I left, I knew I needed space, so I moved to a new part of town, a quiet neighborhood in Pittsburgh. It wasn't far, but it was far enough that I felt like I could start over. I even started writing again, something I hadn't done in years. I'd been keeping an online journal to help me process the breakup, venting my thoughts and feelings. It was private, or at least I thought it was. I never shared it with anyone, and I didn't link it to my social media. It was supposed to be a safe place for me to work through everything. For the first few months after the breakup, things were calm. I didn't hear from Rose, and I didn't reach out. I was still writing in my online diary, using it as a way to keep my head clear. At first, I didn't write much about Rose, but as time passed, I found myself reflecting on the relationship more. It helped in a way to get everything out, to see it in writing. I wrote about how she made me feel, the arguments, the jealousy, the possessiveness, everything I'd bottled up during the time we were together. One night I logged into my diary and noticed something strange. There was a new entry, one I hadn't written. It was short, just a few sentences, but it stopped me cold. It said something like, "You think you're free of me? I know what you've been writing. You don't get to just walk away. At first, I thought it was some sort of glitch. Maybe I'd accidentally saved an old draft or something, but as I looked closer, I realized the words weren't mine. Someone had accessed my account. I checked the login history, but there was no sign of any unusual activity. No other devices had logged in, and everything else seemed normal. But the entry was there, clear as day. I immediately changed my password, figuring that would take care of it. Maybe someone had guessed it or somehow hacked into my account. I didn't want to believe it, but I couldn't think of any other explanation. I tried to shrug it off, but it lingered in the back of my mind. The next morning, I logged in again to check if everything was okay, and another new entry was there. This one was longer, and it made my skin crawl. Whoever had written it knew things, details about my life, things I hadn't told anyone. It was like they had been reading all of my private entries. The writer mocked me, twisting the words I'd written about the breakup, about Rose. They made it sound like I was the one who had ruined the relationship, like I was the one who had driven Rose away. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was her. She had always been tech-savvy, more than me anyway, and it wasn't hard to imagine her finding a way into my account. But why? Why go through all this trouble just to mess with me? We were done. I had moved on. I thought she had too. I blocked the diary, changed the password again, and stopped writing in it altogether. For a while, things were quiet again. I threw myself into work, avoided thinking about Rose or the strange entries, but a few weeks later I started getting emails. They came from a random, untraceable address, and the subject lines were cryptic. Things like, "I know what you've been writing," or "You can't hide from me." The messages themselves were worse. They were filled with quotes from my diary, word for word, as if someone was copying and pasting entire entries. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that Rose was behind it, but I had no proof. She hadn't contacted me directly, and even if I could trace the emails back to her, what could I do? It wasn't illegal to read someone's public diary, and she hadn't made any direct threats. I felt stuck, powerless to stop whatever game she was playing. One night I got an email that made my blood run cold. It was a screenshot of a draft in my online diary. I hadn't written it, but it was saved as if I had. The draft talked about things I hadn't even thought about yet, things I hadn't told anyone. It was like someone was inside my head, putting my deepest, most private thoughts into words before I could even process them myself. That's when I realized this was more than just someone hacking my account. Rose wasn't just reading my entries. She was manipulating them, changing things, putting words in my mouth. It was like she was rewriting my life, controlling the narrative of what I had been through. I deleted the entire diary, wiped it clean. I thought maybe that would be the end of it, but the emails kept coming. It was like Rose had taken control of the entire situation, like she knew I was trying to escape, and she wasn't going to let me. The emails became more personal, more invasive. She knew where I was going, who I was seeing, even things I hadn't told anyone. It wasn't just my online life either. One day I found a note taped to my door. It was the same handwriting as the emails, the same twisted mockery of my own words. "You thought you could just erase me? You can't erase the past." The note was written on a page torn from my old journal, one that I had destroyed months ago. I started to unravel. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on anything without feeling like Rose was still there, lurking somewhere in the background, controlling everything. I changed my phone number, deleted my social media accounts, tried to cut off every possible connection she could have to me, but it didn't help. The messages still found their way through. One night, I got a text from an unknown number. It was a link to a new online diary, one I hadn't created. I clicked it, against my better judgment, and what I saw made my stomach turn. It was full of entries, written in my voice, but they weren't mine. The entries talked about my relationship with Rose, about how much I missed her, how much I regretted leaving. It was like she was trying to rewrite history, to make it seem like I was the one who had been obsessed with her all along. The worst part was the details. The entries mentioned things only I would know, Specific memories, moments we had shared, things I hadn't told anyone. It was like Rose had taken over my identity, writing my life as if she were still in control. And no matter what I did, I couldn't stop it. I went to the police, but they couldn't do anything. Without any concrete threats or evidence of harm, they said it was just a case of online harassment. I felt like I was losing my mind. Rose was everywhere, my email, my phone, my life. I didn't know how she was doing it, but she had found a way to stay connected, to keep me trapped in the relationship even after I had left. I started isolating myself. I stopped seeing friends, stopped going out, stopped writing altogether. Every time I tried to start over, Rose would find a way to pull me back in, to remind me that I wasn't free. She was always one step ahead, always watching, always waiting for the right moment to strike. I haven't written anything in months. I don't know how to escape this. Rose's control over my life feels absolute, and no matter how many times I try to break free, she pulls me back in. It's like she's always there, rewriting my life. I didn't think I'd ever be the kind of person to need therapy, but after what I went through with Greg, I knew I had to do something. The relationship had been toxic. There's no other word for it. It wasn't always that way. When we first met, he was charming, attentive, and made me feel like I was the center of his world. But over time, that attention turned into control. He needed to know where I was at all times, who I was with, and what I was doing. Every decision I made, he had to be involved in. If I didn't respond to his texts immediately, he'd bombard me with calls, sometimes showing up unannounced at my place, demanding to know why I hadn't answered. The worst part was how subtle it was in the beginning. It didn't start with screaming or accusations. It started with small things, like asking me to text him when I got home or wanting to know what I was wearing when I went out. It seemed like he cared, like he was just being protective. But soon enough it became suffocating. Every part of my life was under his control, and I didn't realize how bad it was until I couldn't do anything without wondering how he would react. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. After nearly a year together, I broke things off. I thought it would be ugly. Greg wasn't the type to let go easily, but surprisingly, he didn't put up much of a fight. He seemed hurt, even apologetic, and promised to leave me alone. For a while, I actually believed him. That's when I decided to go to therapy. A friend recommended a therapist in the city, someone she said had helped her through a rough time. The idea of talking to a stranger about my problems wasn't appealing, but I knew I needed to work through the mess Greg had left in my head. So I made an appointment. My therapist's name was Dr. Jacobs. Her office was in downtown Chicago, tucked into a quiet, unassuming building. From the moment I stepped into the waiting room, I felt a little more at ease. It was a small, cozy space with soft lighting and comfortable chairs. I sat there, flipping through a magazine, trying to steady my nerves. When I finally met Dr. Jacobs, she seemed kind. She had this calm, reassuring presence that made it easy to open up. We started slowly, with me talking about the breakup and how Greg's behavior had left me feeling anxious, paranoid, and drained. Over the next few weeks, I told her everything about the constant monitoring, the way he'd manipulate situations to make me feel guilty, and how I'd lost touch with friends and family because of him. It was a relief to talk to someone who wasn't judging me, someone who seemed to understand what I was going through. I started feeling like I was making progress, like I was finally putting Greg behind me. Then, one session, Dr. Jacobs mentioned something strange. We were talking about a particular argument Greg and I had, something about me going to a friend's party without him. I hadn't told her all the details, but she seemed to know more than I'd shared. She made a comment about how Greg had reacted when I got home from the party, but I hadn't told her what had happened after the party. I hadn't mentioned that night at all in any specific detail. I froze for a second, but I brushed it off, thinking maybe I had mentioned it in passing and just forgotten. But over the next few sessions, it happened again. Dr. Jacobs would bring up small details, things I hadn't shared with her, like the specific texts Greg had sent me or the exact words he'd used during one of our fights. I started to feel uneasy. How could she know all of this? I thought maybe I was misremembering things. Maybe I'd said more than I realized in our earlier sessions, so I didn't say anything at first. But it kept happening. She'd mentioned details about places I'd been with Greg, conversations we'd had, things that were too specific for me to have accidentally shared. I began to wonder if she was reading between the lines, piecing things together from the broader stories I told, but it didn't make sense. The level of detail was too exact. One night, after a particularly unsettling session, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, replaying the session in my head, trying to figure out how Dr. Jacobs knew so much. That's when it hit me. Greg. He'd always been tech-savvy. He worked in IT and had a way of knowing things I hadn't told him, even when we were together. At the time, I had chalked it up to him being observant, but now I started to wonder if it was more than that. The next day, I checked my phone for any signs of spyware or tracking apps. Nothing stood out, but I wasn't exactly an expert. I thought about going to a professional to have my devices checked, but I was embarrassed. Who would believe me? I couldn't exactly tell someone that I thought my ex might be spying on me through my therapist. During my next session with Dr. Jacobs, I was more guarded. I didn't want to let on that I was suspicious, but I also didn't want to share too much. She noticed. She asked why I seemed closed off, and I made up an excuse about having a rough week at work. But again, she brought up something I hadn't told her, something about a message Greg had sent me after we broke up. I hadn't even mentioned that we'd had contact after the breakup, but she knew. I left the session feeling sick. The more I thought about it, the more certain I became that Greg was somehow involved. Maybe he was feeding her information. Maybe he had found a way to get into my phone or my email. It wasn't just paranoia anymore. There was no other explanation for how she knew these things. I started doing some digging. I looked up Dr. Jacobs online, trying to find any connection between her and Greg, but there was nothing. She seemed legitimate, licensed, with good reviews and no red flags. I even asked my friend who had recommended her if she'd ever experienced anything weird, but she hadn't. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I stopped going to therapy for a while, telling Dr. Jacobs that I needed a break. She didn't push back too hard, but she did send me a few emails, checking in, asking how I was doing. I didn't respond. I just needed space to figure out what was going on. Then, about a month later, I got a message from Greg. It was casual, like he was just checking in, but the timing felt too perfect. I hadn't heard from him in months, and now, just as I was pulling back from therapy, he was reaching out. I ignored the message, but a few days later I got another one. This time it was more personal. He asked how I was dealing with the breakup and mentioned things I had talked about in therapy, things I hadn't told anyone except Dr. Jacobs. That's when I knew. He had to be involved somehow. There was no other way he could know those details. I started to panic, wondering if he had access to my phone, my computer, or if he had been in contact with Dr. Jacobs this whole time. I didn't know who I could trust anymore. I went to a different therapist, someone completely unconnected to the first, and explained everything. She listened, but I could tell she was skeptical. I didn't have any proof, and it all sounded far-fetched. But to me, it was real. I wasn't imagining this. I started to withdraw from everyone. I cut off contact with friends, stopped responding to messages from anyone who knew Greg, and changed all of my passwords, but it didn't help. The sense of being watched, of having every part of my life under scrutiny, didn't go away. Eventually, I moved out of Chicago. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I just packed up my things and left, hoping that putting distance between me and Greg would give me some peace. I had been out of my relationship with Natalie for almost a year when the strange things started happening. We were together for 3 years, and by the time it ended, I felt completely drained. She was possessive in a way that snuck up on me. It wasn't all at once. It was gradual, like boiling a frog. She'd start with little things, like asking if she could help me manage my finances or suggesting that I let her handle things like paying the bills. I thought it was thoughtful at first, like she was just trying to take something off my plate. But over time, it turned into complete control. By the end of it, I barely had access to my own accounts. Every time I tried to bring it up or ask to take back control, she'd make me feel guilty, like I was ungrateful for everything she'd done. It was exhausting. When we broke up, I thought I'd finally get my life back. I changed all my passwords, set up new accounts, and made sure I had control over my finances again. It felt liberating, like I could breathe. I moved into a new apartment in Denver, started focusing on my work, and even started dating someone new, Sarah. Things were looking up for the first time in a long time. Then, one day, I noticed something strange with my bank account. I was going over my transactions, just checking to make sure everything was in order, when I saw a small charge I didn't recognize. It wasn't much, just $10, but I didn't remember spending it. It was from some random online store I'd never heard of. I figured it was probably a mistake or maybe some subscription I'd forgotten about. I didn't think much of it. A week later, I saw another charge. This time it was $25 from a different site. Again, I hadn't bought anything. I called the bank thinking my account had been compromised, and they said they'd investigate. They refunded the charges and issued me a new card. I thought that would be the end of it, but the charges didn't stop. Even after getting a new card, I started seeing more and more small transactions. Some were for just a few dollars, others for larger amounts. Each one from a different store, different online platform, different service I didn't recognize. I called the bank again and they assured me my account was secure. They couldn't explain how the charges kept happening. They suggested that maybe I had signed up for multiple subscriptions and forgotten about them. But I knew I hadn't. I started getting paranoid. Every time I logged into my bank account, I'd find something new, a small charge here, a random payment there. It wasn't enough to make a huge dent in my finances, but it was unsettling. It was like someone was slowly draining my account without me even realizing it. I went through all my emails, searching for receipts or confirmations, trying to figure out where these charges were coming from. That's when I found it. An old email from Natalie. It wasn't anything suspicious at first glance, just a random message from when we were still together. But as I looked closer, I realized it was linked to one of the accounts that had been making charges on my card. That's when it hit me. Natalie had my account information. She knew all my passwords, all my details. Even though I'd changed everything after the breakup, she must have found a way to access it again. She'd always been good with tech, and it wouldn't have been hard for her to get back in, especially if she'd planted something on my computer while we were together. I started to piece it all together. The small, insignificant charges, the random transactions. She was messing with me, taking just enough to keep me on edge, but never enough for me to notice right away. I tried confronting her, but she denied everything. She acted like she had no idea what I was talking about, like I was crazy for even suggesting it. But I knew. It was her. No one else had access to that information. No one else would even care. I blocked her on everything, changed all my passwords again, and hoped that would be the end of it. It wasn't. A few days later, I got a notification from my bank about another charge. This time it was over $100. I hadn't made the purchase. I hadn't even been online that day. I called the bank in a panic, demanding they shut down the account. They told me the charge had been made using my login details, my username, my password. Everything matched up. It didn't make sense. I checked my accounts again, going through every charge, every transaction, and found even more strange activity. Not just on my bank account, but on other accounts too. My email, my social media. It was like someone had been going through my entire digital life, leaving small traces behind, but never enough to be obvious. I changed my passwords for what felt like the 100th time, but it didn't help. The charges kept coming. Then I started getting texts. They were from an unknown number, but the messages were personal, too personal. They referenced things only Natalie would know, inside jokes we had shared, places we had been together. I hadn't spoken to her in months, but it was like she was still in my life, still controlling everything from behind the scenes. One of the texts said something like, "You can't run from me, I'll always know where you are." That's when I realized it wasn't just about the money, it was about control. Natalie wasn't trying to ruin me financially. She was trying to remind me that she was still in charge, even after I had left. She knew my every move, every transaction, every message I sent. I started to feel like there was no way out. I called the bank again, but they told me the same thing. They couldn't find any sign of fraud. As far as they were concerned, all the charges were legitimate. I couldn't prove that Natalie was behind it. I couldn't even get them to believe me. It got worse from there. I'd go out with Sarah, and a few hours later, I'd get a text from that same unknown number. The messages would describe what we'd done, where we'd been, what we'd talked about. It was like Natalie was following me, watching my every move. I started looking over my shoulder everywhere I went, wondering if she was there, lurking somewhere nearby. I checked my phone, my computer, everything for spyware, but I couldn't find anything. It didn't matter, though. She didn't need to be physically present to keep messing with me. She had all the information she needed, my passwords, my bank details, my entire digital life, and she was using it to make sure I never forgot about her. I thought about going to the police, but what would I say? That my ex was somehow still in my accounts, still controlling my finances, still following me through my phone? I had no proof. Just a bunch of small, unexplained charges and a series of texts from an unknown number. They'd laugh me out of the station. Eventually, I stopped going out. I didn't want to give her any more ammunition. I cut off contact with most of my friends, stopped using social media, and even stopped seeing Sarah. It wasn't fair to drag her into this mess. I couldn't shake the feeling that Natalie was watching, waiting for me to slip up again so she could take something else from me. Thank you for watching. If you found these stories gripping, don't forget to subscribe for more spine-tingling content. For another hair-raising tale, check out our suggested video. And if you're hungry for more eerie encounters, dive into our playlist featuring similar chilling narratives.